To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people, and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7 so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the stations in the city. My story begins when I was working overnights at a gas station/liquor store when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online so that they wouldn't run my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working on overnights for a long time. Even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of the lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into the liquor store and gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced on one night, before I started working there, that a woman who came in to buy milk went outside to her car, only for a man to come up behind her and then shove a gun up to her back, then demanding her for money. She complied with him, and luckily, he let her go. She ran into the store sobbing hysterically, and though the police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred to having two people on with me, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The night seemed to go by so much quicker when someone else was there, and it was really nice that the person I normally close with got along with me so well. Overall, there were 4 overnight shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and was really only working there as a favor to one of the managers, so she would really only work about 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I about 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't really particularly like the job or really want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work, but it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't really complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a little bit different. He worked there 5 days a week just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with more than one person 1 day a week. Nobody seemed to really like him or like working with him. Nick was also a little off from the start. He was one of those people who basically told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one was really comfortable with hearing. One thing that he always seemed to talk about was the strain that was on his marriage. Apparently, he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to the people in that kind of job being sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that when he was younger, he was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had to take a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't be violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay. We all have our problems, and some people get dealt a really bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I myself have always really struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I mean, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I'd probably be hospitalized in danger to self categories, so as creepy as that was, I just assured them that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick with it and you're honest with medical professionals, there's no reason you can't still do anything anyone else can do. He seemed really pleased with this answer, and soon after, the subject was then turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for about the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and he felt like things were really going well with them. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished that he would just stop talking to me about it and would really just leave me alone. Josh had a wife and daughter who was about 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but to see us younger girls as kind of like his daughter and what she might have to deal with one day. He also seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was really grateful for, and he didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't too long before Nick had started conversations with me going into details about why I was diagnosed instead of how his medicine was working, which I won't get into because a lot of it was very violent and sexual. I told him repeatedly that I really didn't want to know about that, to which he would act like he understood and then change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided in Dixie about it, she told me that she would take care of it. She later told her friend about it, which was the same manager who asked her to come work there. The manager said she couldn't really do much since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him after he was talked to by the manager, and soon enough, about 2 other women who had worked with him on the night shift reported comments that he made to them to the manager. I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were pretty similar to the things that had been said to me. Nick was then given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, he would go on these rants about how the people that were reporting him only did it because they didn't like him. I assumed that he didn't know that I had been questioned too, and neither I or Josh had any intention to tell him. He got so angry at one point that he was practically in tears, saying how those lucky whores were really lucky that he was on his meds and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about that point that his shift had ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh then told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we really didn't have time to chat with him. He nodded and walked out the door without another word. Josh wasn't lying either. The truck had arrived extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that still needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do unless they absolutely had to was stocking the drink coolers. It was true that it was easier to do at night when there was a lot less customers, so it was pretty annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. I can't really remember the time that Josh had went into the drink cooler, but it must have been pretty late since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still pretty focused on stocking all of the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell had chimed, signaling that someone had come into the store. I threw out a good evening and said that I'd be right there, since anyone that usually came in that late usually just wanted a pack of cigarettes or to pay for gas. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning over to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I wasn't able to detect it right away, as the smell of booze always seemed to linger in the air around there anyways. And Josh was right on the other side of the wall. Even so, I actually considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go or if I should run into the cooler and go get Josh. Nick wasn't a young fit guy or anything, but years of drugs and drinking had really aged him prematurely and totally ruined his body. But I mean, he was still pretty intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me when, probably tired of waiting, turned right toward me, and that's when I noticed something immediately was off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He just stared at me. There was nothing on his face to tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he then spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring.
Did he leave you alone?
It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler, and then I asked if he wanted me to go get him. And once again, he was just staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. The silent staring was really creeping me out. I then decided to ask with more force in my voice. "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he then grinned at me in a really disgusting, almost singing voice. Then he said,
"You're lying. I know you're alone."
He laughed and then he took a step toward me but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps backwards. At this point, I should have just run to Josh. I should have called for him, really anything, but I really couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. I mean, Nick was really weird, but I had never felt like I was in actual danger around him. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow stumbling steps, then saying,
"Come here, I just want to talk."
I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that that was specifically amusing, and he laughed loudly enough that Josh had told me later was what caused him to look through the spaces of the racks to see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second, and he seemed to come out of nowhere, then shoving himself in between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything. They just stared each other down before Josh then said in a really stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick just blankly stared for a moment, then scoffed, then telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there and had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against Nick. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corraling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both of our parts, Nick then turned and then took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh then grabbed the back of his coat and then brought him down as he then smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area. I'm not really sure which, but he used the opportunity of his sputtering to drag him to the door and then throw him out, now locking it. Josh had just turned and he told me to call the cops as we then heard this sickening crack from behind him. We both jumped and looked at the door to then find this really big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever seen a movie or one of an actual car wreck when something hits a windshield, but not hard enough to break through, and it turns white all around the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't have to tell me what to do. This time I ran to the register, grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the front door, and then huddled on the floor. I didn't even notice at the time, but Josh had told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time that he noticed that Nick had a knife in his other hand. The fact that he tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was absolutely sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't even know how she understood me. I was crying so loud. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the floor, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address because just as I got up to look at a receipt to what the address was, the glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that the officers were already on the way and to do whatever I could to get away or even hide, even if that meant that I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, but he made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and then throwing it at the part of the window that he had been repeatedly punching, causing it to break through. He didn't make it to break through though. From that hole, he could reach the lock on the door, then get back inside. According to Josh, he had walked up to the door and then he put his mouth against the hole that he had just formed, and then said something that even right now I still sob over. In that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I talked to him that night. He then said in such a happy tone,
"They're never going to find you two."
Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was shitting bricks just as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole, and he wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh then slammed his entire body into it, knocking Nick backwards from the impact. Josh then yelled for me to run, and even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment, I ran right behind him to the receiving doors that were in the back of the store. Nick was cursing and yelling for us as the door jingle went off. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain, as he then realized that it wouldn't open. We found out later that Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it again before he came in. We seemed to both realize at once that he had actually planned this all out to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me some time to slam the back room door shut and then lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut, when Nick then finally reached it. He must have heard me crying because he kept calling my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted, He would make sure that I died before I felt any kind of pain if I opened the door for him. He then started stabbing the door, then screaming at me to open it. I screamed and then I moved when he stabbed it the first time, but Josh and I both then moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I just couldn't think of anything to say. I was just as terrified myself. I had dropped my phone when I ran to hold the door shut, and neither of us could move to go get it. So we really had no idea how long it would be until the police got there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't really last long against his body slams. And there was absolutely no protection if his knife went into one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here tonight. That my dog would never know why I didn't come home. That I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life. That all of the plans for the future that my girlfriend and I had made would never happen. In the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever, it suddenly went silent. There was no police car alarms, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, then listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when we heard a gunshot then go off once, then twice, then a third time. There was more silence, then at last a voice rang out, then asking if anyone was here. We weren't really sure if we should say anything. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed all of the things aside in front of the door, opening it enough just to put his head out of it, and then it seemed like all of the breath just totally left him. He opened the door and went out into the store. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer was, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but that they were all pretty far away and he had a really horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there because though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said that he would have run after him, but with the state that the store was in, he was really scared that someone in the store could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a total blur. Josh and I were just sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police finally arrived. The EMT had called dispatch and he told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were then diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got to go home and came in to see my dog's wiggling body as he was so excited to see me. Nick was found about 2 weeks later in an old RV that he had in the woods. The reason that he had come after us was because he thought that the reason Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had actually kicked him out about 4 days before this all happened, and she was actually in the process of getting a restraining order against him, due to a bunch of threatening texts and phone calls that she had been getting. Nick stated to the police that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target and he really didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called an owner or even a manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. It was really disturbing what he was saying in hindsight, but we were so used to him being a creep and saying really horrible things that it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent toward anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired. So I mean, it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. Nick took a plea deal. He did this so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped, and instead would go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason that I'm writing this story now is that I got a phone call about 2 weeks ago. It was basically notifying me that as long as there's no setbacks to his health, Nick is actually set to be released on June 8th of this year. When I called Josh, he said that he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city. I've switched to going to college completely online, and I'm in a new place that I'm renting with a roommate. I really don't think that he'll ever come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I read so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone always seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I really don't think that I'd be any more prepared to face him this time than I was back then. I've had some pretty intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence louder and clearer than I've ever heard it since it was actually said.
They're never going to find you two.
Nick, if it's really true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I never feel safe, especially at night. I'm honestly going to do my best to move on from this, but I just don't know how. Wish me luck.
Back when I was a senior in high school, I had a weekend job pumping gas at a highway gas station here in New Jersey. I saw all kinds of crazy stuff in the year or so that I worked there, but honestly, most of the stuff just came across as funny nowadays. Like even some of the closer calls with crazy customers or the time that I got robbed, I wasn't really in any life-threatening danger. I know how to handle myself, and I know not to do anything but cooperate with someone desperate enough to stick a gun in my face. We're trained to give up the money. It's insured, but there's no putting my brains back in my skull if I decide to be a hero over $50 in change. I mean, come on. The guy was even more scared than I was, so now it's ended up being like a crazy but not so scary story that I have no problem telling at parties or on dates or whatever. But then there's this one thing that happened that I don't bring up so easily, and that only ever comes out when people want to know what's the worst thing I saw. Sometimes I'm not even in the mood to talk about it, because I know that it can't have been just some rare one-time thing that only ever happened to me. But other times I feel like I gotta warn people, so they'll recognize it and act on it like I did. That's another part of this I hate. I feel like it sounds as if though I'm trying to make myself out as some hero in this situation, but I can promise you, I don't feel that way at all. I feel like I did the bare minimum, but enough intro, I'll get to the story. One night, I was working the night shift when an Audi with South Carolina license plates pulled in at around 2 in the morning. Some guy got out, asking me to fill up his car while he went to the bathroom. He put a $20 bill into my shirt pocket, promising another $20 if I could get the tank filled up quickly. Naturally, I rushed to do as he said, and I noticed a middle school-age girl asleep in the back seat, covered up to her chin with a blanket. I didn't want to wake her and risk losing my tip, so I proceeded to fill the tank as fast as I could while still being careful, keeping an eye on her to ensure that she wasn't waking up. She remained asleep, and as I focused more on filling the tank, I suddenly got this chill through myself when I looked back up at her. She was staring at me with her eyes wide open. Before I could say anything, she mouthed 2 clear words through the glass to me. "Help me." There was a moment where I just stopped dead, hand on the gas pump no longer filling up, and then I heard his voice asking, "Hey, everything all right over there?" I had to think on my feet pretty quick. I told him that something was wrong with the pump and that I could head back inside to reset it so the gas would start pumping again. I went on about how it had been happening on and off all day, apologized for the inconvenience, and assured him that it would be working in just a second. I ran inside, pushed the silent alarm, and then walked back out to finish filling up his tank. He fell for the whole thing, and if I say so myself, I put on an Emmy-winning performance and not completely freaking out and either strangling him or making some misguided attempt to actually rescue the girl. The cops later told me that I did the right thing. I had his plate number on the cameras, I got a good look at him and the girl, and his fingerprints were on the cash that he gave me. I made sure to call 911 as soon as they left, but thanks to the silent alarm, a patrol unit was already on the way to me. The dispatcher redirected the cop to the road the guy pulled off onto, and bingo, he was pulled over on a traffic stop. Supposedly all ended well for that particular girl, but how many others don't get a chance to signal for help like that? How many end up in the trunk instead of the back seat? How many don't get rescued? It's those kind of questions that I try not to think about, which is why I don't like telling this story too much. However, I feel it's important to share it sometimes as a warning. If this reaches as many people as possible, maybe it'll save me a whole lot of breath and a whole lot of sleepless nights.
For a little backstory, this all took place when COVID-19 had shut everything down in March 2020. I was sent home from my college and I had to do with Zoom classes, and I also went back to work at the burger joint that I would work at whenever I was home on breaks. I won't say the name of the place, but it was always very busy, and during COVID it made us even busier due to us being a fast food place, so we never had to close down, but other places in the plaza did. We always had some really crazy and nasty people, but the pandemic just made everyone so much worse. At the time, we had this one regular that would come in who we thought had some mental problems multiple times a week. He would be really emotionless in his talking and just gave really blank dead stares towards everyone, and just stood there like a gargoyle, really intimidating and statuesque. He would ride his bike up to the walk-up area and look through the sliding windows until one of us got to taking his order. But he only really liked certain people to take his order and was also very cold towards us. He would order the same thing every time, but wants it fresh right out of the grease and handled by once again only certain people. And to make sure of it, he'll intensely stare at us through the pickup window. He would make the other customers outside so uncomfortable that they would walk away or they would just sit in their cars until he left. He used to only come in during the day shifts, but because days were much busier than the night shifts, and with all his demands that he would give us every time, my manager got fed up and told him to no longer come here during the day, thus now making him a night shift problem. During the week, I would work night shifts because of class, and I would usually be clocking out by 10 p.m. It was around 9:30 and I was closing my side down and starting to clean when he then rolled up on his bike. I happened to be one of the few people he let take his order, so as usual I took his order. He wants everything completely fresh, the standard list of demands. But one demand he gave was new. He always orders a side of fries with his meal, and sometimes to put the fries in the carton we either use a scooper or tongs. He asked us to use the scooper instead of the tongs because it'll give him more fries. Me just wanting him to leave and being close to leaving myself, I just went over and told the fry guy what he wanted. The fry guy just rolled his eyes, knowing how annoying this guy is, and dropped some new fries in the grease for him. The fry guy went on a break shortly after, and the night manager took over a station and waited for the fries to be ready. She didn't know it was this guy though, and she used the tongs to put the fries in the carton. She then hands me the order to pass out. The guy slides open the window, and he told me that she didn't do what he asked and that he wants more fries in his bag, since it looked like she didn't put enough in, which she put plenty in. He just didn't get his way. Once again, just wanting to leave after I'm done with him, I just oblige and go back. My coworker who I'm going to call Lee calls back and says that I shouldn't let him do that. I then called back saying that we've been letting him control us for months, and it's not my problem to handle a manager's problem if he has issues. My night manager hears this and sees it's the guy at the window. They then groan and they ask me what the issue is with him this time. I explained her the story and she went up to him and told him that it makes no difference what she does. He's getting his order fresh every single time by the people he wants to make his order, so to just suck it up and take the bag. She hands him the bag and then storms in the back to finish her inventory. The guy then pokes his arm and head in the window and tries to get one of the other coworkers to remake his order. Coworker and I both said that we're not going to do that since there was nothing even wrong with his food. Well, he doesn't like this, and he actually throws his bag of food inside the store and spills it all over the floor. E sees this and absolutely loses it. She runs over to the window that he's still in and then screams at him how he can't disrespect us like this, and that we for sure won't be remaking his order now, but we'll give him his money back. He then screams at her, and they actually go at it for a few minutes. I call up the night manager, and she runs up to also scream at him. As he gives the guy back his money, he actually grabs her arm and then yanks her almost through the window. Now, because of the pandemic, we have these plastic dividers at the top of where the customer would be speaking to. So if that wasn't there, she would have went straight through the window. Now everyone is screaming at this guy to get the hell out of there and that we're calling the cops as he just assaulted a minor. Earlier that week, E had racial slurs screamed at her by a bunch of rednecks because she was black. I felt really bad for her dealing with two big issues that happened in such a short period of time. She broke out of his grasp and ran to the back. The guy didn't even leave. In his crazy, twisted mind, he thought he was in the right here. He was running in circles outside of our walk-up area and was actually screaming to himself about E and how he's gonna set the cops on us. He tries banging on the windows to further get our attention, but we just ignored him. 4 cop cars drove in, blocking the entrance and the exit of the drive-thru so that no one can come in or leave. They talked to him and the guy just isn't grasping that he attacked a minor and he's crazy. The owner of the company sends in the security footage of just what happened to the cops, and we set the guy on trespassing. The guy actually had to be escorted off the property because he wouldn't leave. He thankfully hasn't come in since that day, but we still see him riding around the road next to our place, and he gives us menacing looks every time he passes by, not once breaking eye contact. He really wasn't right in the head. The dead stares he would give us through the windows, the emotionless way he would speak to us, how picky he was with everything, and how quick he snapped and resorted to violence. It was insane. Very fortunately, E didn't get any injuries from the incident and was only shaken up, but she did quit a few weeks later, and I can't really blame her. I feel really bad for her. No one should ever have to deal with being assaulted by customers or having racial slurs spewed at them. She was way too young to have to deal with that.
Back in 2015, I attended high school at an age where I was younger than most students. The reason for this was because I had skipped about 2 grades due to my parents thinking I wasn't being challenged enough. To put it in basic terms, I was a smart kid and had the gift of being intelligent in my studies. Anyway, this happened the week before spring break, and I remember being in my biology class. Our teacher was going over some stuff about the examination of frogs, which sort of entertained us. As we're about halfway through the lecture, our principal, Mr. Hernandez, got on the loudspeaker and told the school we were going on lockdown. All teachers and faculty were required to lock their doors and get their students to the safest place of the room. My teacher had ordered us to move to the back of the class since we didn't have a closet. He locks the door, turns off the lights, and we wait until the all clear. I'd say we sat in total silence for a good few minutes before we hear the sound of the main doors opening from the hall. My thought was that it could have been police, but something told me it was anything but that. Not even a minute later, we begin to hear these deranged screams coming from down the hallway. To be honest, I wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman's voice, but whoever it was sounded like an actual lunatic. The whole class began to look at each other, with terror written on their faces. One of the girls' phones in my class had gone off, and that caused everyone to become even more worried. As the screaming got closer, I came to the realization that it was a man with this extremely deep voice. What he was saying still chills me to the bone. He was going door to door while banging on them, saying what he'll do when he gets in. The stuff he's saying is horrendous to the point where the majority of us are texting our parents and calling 911. He did this to every door until he eventually came to ours, going to town on it very hard. Thankfully, this was one of the few schools that had bulletproof doors, so I knew the chances of him getting in were slim. Even though the doors were stable, he still gave it a good beating. The sounds of those bangs and screams will forever be burned into the back of my head. Suddenly, he straight up punches through the small glass window while trying to reach the lock from the inside. At this point, everyone is terrified to the point where my teacher had to force his arm out of the window. This thankfully seemed to work, as he then continued down the hall with those horrid screams toward the main office. However, he didn't make it far, as police did end up entering the building and restraining him with ease. After about an hour, our principal gave the all clear and had ended school early that day. The school faculty had to personally escort students safely out of the building, as we didn't know who else was around. It wasn't until a week later where I learned a shocking truth as to what led up to this. The story behind why and how we got into the school will forever haunt me. As it turns out, he was being transported to a facility when he managed to rip off the frame that separates him and the driver. He knocked the driver out cold and put the vehicle to a stop right near the school where he got out and entered the building. He was insanely strong and had been off his meds for days. The driver who was transporting him was fortunately okay and was given proper treatment. Thankfully, nobody was hurt when he entered the school. After that, many parents were outside picking up their kids in a panic. My parents had gone to the school and picked me up as well, and even pulled me out for a few days. As far as I'm concerned, he was likely taken back to a mental facility and is being held there. For the next few weeks, the school had begun doing lockdown drills as a precaution. Nothing has happened since, but I just hope he's getting the proper help he needs. This story is told in the perspective of a female. This took place in the spring of 2016 in my freshman year of high school when I was around 14 or so. Around this time was the peak of the whole infamous clown sighting epidemic that spread around like wildfire. These events blew up on social media that got the attention of everyone. If you were a teen or in school around that time, you definitely know what I'm talking about. Long story short, it was the next big thing that just never went away. In my mind, I had thought that it wasn't as serious as some people thought, but little did I know, I was beyond wrong. To be exact, this happened on March 25th of 2016, where I was in my last period of the day. If I remember, I was in history class and we had just finished up an assignment on the Titanic and the history of it. At one point, I asked my teacher if I could use the restroom for a minute since I had completed the project early. Being the sweet and charming teacher she was, she said yes and gave me the pass. The restroom near my class was being cleaned, so I had to use the one on the other side of the building. As I'm making my way over to the other hallway, I look down the hall and see, out of all things, a person dressed in a clown costume. My initial thought was that it was probably just someone doing a prank because of the trend. I must say, the costume appeared very realistic in detail, even if it was a joke. Needless to say, however, it creeped me the hell out. I give a quick nod to the clown as I entered the girls' restroom, not thinking too much of it. As I'm doing my business, I hear the PA turn on in the hall and inform everyone that we were on lockdown. My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as I heard this, and knew right then that it had to be because of the clown. That being said, I pull up my pants and, as I look up, I see the clown's head peeking in above the stall. I let out what was probably the loudest scream I've ever done as I pushed open the door. The person in the clown costume obviously fell to the ground as I ran out of the bathroom. I ran straight to my teacher's room, practically begging for her to unlock the door so I could get in. However, I knew she couldn't, as there was also a chance whoever that was would get in too. She told me from the other side of the door that I had to run and hide somewhere safe. I ended up running out of the hall and ran inside some electrical room that happened to be unlocked. The sound of a machine humming could be heard, so I figured that it would make it seem less likely that I was here. Suddenly, I then hear several sets of footsteps enter the building yelling police. I look through the vent on the door and see about 10 or so officers and a few SWAT guards surrounding the area. I felt safe, but I didn't want to come out with the possibility of startling them. 10 minutes go by, and I see them walk out of the building with 2 clowns in handcuffs, one of them being the one I saw. The other one had this sort of samurai machete thing that was in fact real. Turns out, these 2 clowns actually went to my school, but had gotten suspended for their behavior. They then went on to say that it was just for the trend and that they didn't intend to actually harm anyone. However, police weren't buying it and arrested them no matter what the intentions were. After that, I eventually came out of the room and walked over to them to explain what had happened. They brought me into the main office, where I was with a faculty member until my parents arrived. As far as I know, those 2 boys were expelled from school and had served months in jail as they were 18. My parents ended up moving me to another school after that, and ever since then, I've always developed a fear of clowns. It took nearly half a year for the whole clown trend to die down. To be honest, I had never really understood the hype around it. Even with that whole situation, I still heard of many reports of people encountering clowns and almost getting hurt. Thankfully, nothing like that has ever happened again. When I was in my mid-20s, I got a job as a janitor at a local high school to make some extra cash for a car I wanted. It wasn't the best job, but it was good enough to support myself financially, as well as helping my parents with bills. My duties basically consisted of the usual tasks you would think a janitor does: mopping, sweeping, cleaning windows, etc. I worked only 4 days a week, which was a decent schedule and a chill job. Most of these days I'd end up working the night shift, but one day I had been called in for a day shift. The reason for this was because of some stupid prank that a few seniors had done for the end of the year. Every year, all of the seniors would throw what's called a senior prank, which was amusing to them, but definitely not the janitors. Long story short, it was a food fight, so me and another janitor, Todd, had to clean up the whole thing. Fortunately, this was around the time when all students had been in 5th period, so it was relatively quiet. It was just me and Todd that had the whole cafeteria to ourselves. Anyway, as I'm picking up the trash, the PA comes on and it's the principal of the school. She sounds terrified and out of breath for whatever reason and went on to say that this was a code red. My fellow janitor and I had been instructed to hide in the closet and to not leave until the all clear. We go inside the closet and I'm texting my mom that the school is locked down and that I didn't know what was going on. Minutes felt like hours waiting in the closet for something to happen. Suddenly, the main doors to the cafeteria open with full force. Looking up at the ceiling was a tall, pale woman just standing there, making these strange noises. In her hand, a knife. She begins to walk around the cafeteria while yelling out these deranged phrases. Everything from come out wherever you are to I'll kill all of you. It was pretty obvious that this woman was clearly mentally ill with possibly in possession of drugs. All of a sudden, my phone starts to ring like crazy, and I see that it's my mom who thankfully got my attention. It also got the attention from the woman staring in the direction of the closet. Suddenly, I can start to see her slowly making her way toward the closet with the knife in hand. All the while, she's kind of just crouching while slowly walking as if she were trying to be stealthy. In that moment, I wasn't sure what I was gonna do to protect myself. My initial thought was to somehow fight back, but we're in a small janitorial closet with little room. On top of that, I had no idea what she was capable of, especially when she had a knife. Seconds felt like hours as she made her way over to the closet door where I just prayed for the best. I shit you not, I actually felt like these were my last moments. She was gonna come in here and kill us, I just knew it. Just as I was about to hopefully tackle this woman, I hear loud yelling coming from the main doors. Thankfully, police opened the doors with their guns drawn, telling her to get down and for Todd and I to come out slowly. After multiple attempts of her trying to resist arrest, the cops tased her, and it was then where she was put in cuffs. As it turns out, this woman had come into school through the main entrance and had assaulted both the principal and the woman working at the front desk. After all, this was in the mid-2000s, so the school couldn't afford to install proper security equipment, so we were essentially sitting ducks. While the school didn't have any security equipment, they apparently managed to get some grants to afford better security staff. While this was certainly an unfortunate situation, there's still one fact that always terrifies me. The only reason police were so quick to arrive was because there just so happened to be only one patrol car in the area. Keep in mind, the school was relatively far out in the suburbs and there wasn't a police station for a few miles. It just makes you wonder what would have happened had police arrived a minute later. I'm thankful no one was hurt, and I'm not sure as to how that woman is doing today. But this was sure as hell one of the scariest situations I've ever been in. After that incident, I quit my janitor job and went back to school to pursue my degree in tech. Fast forward 15 years later, and I now work for a great design company where I was thankfully able to make a good living off it. However, there are times when this incident still comes back into mind while I sleep. I still sometimes tell my story to others, but I most of the time just keep it to myself.
I was one of the luckiest kids in our high school that had the privilege of driving into school about halfway through the day. Our school day was divided into 9 periods, and because I had enough credits to graduate aside from a select few, I was always allowed to show up right before the 4th period. That was when my first class was. The day started out like any other. I woke up and got myself ready for school. I remember the steam pouring off my coffee cup was intense that morning, but the heat was a refreshing contrast to the cold bite of the winter air. I loaded everything up into my car and drove the 8 miles to get to my school. My phone kept going off, which was irritating because the notification sound kept interrupting the music playing from it. I ignored the messages and figured whatever it was could wait until I got to school. When I arrived, I noticed that something was off. The parking lot was full of cars, but no students. I mean, I knew it was a bit late in the day, but there were actually quite a few of us who would show up around the same time. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I just brushed it off and just assumed they had already made their way into the semi-warm school. So I decided to do the same. I grabbed my phone and my bag, locked my car, and walked into the lobby, only to be met with silence. Something wasn't right. I looked at my watch, and it was 10:36 a.m. The hall should have been full of students who had been rushing to get to their next class. I didn't understand why at the time, but for some reason, the emptiness of the halls made everything feel tense. I began to walk a bit down the hall. That was when I noticed that all the classroom doors were shut, which was odd because most of the teachers liked to keep them open, as long as it wasn't too loud in the halls. Then all of a sudden, I remember the spam of messages I had gotten on my way into school. I almost threw my phone with how hard I ripped it from my pocket. I put in my passcode and then came face to face with one of my biggest fears. My phone had 4 text messages from my friend who had been trying desperately to get in contact with me. The messages read in order: "Yo, something weird is going on. Hey man, are you on your way yet? Yo, don't come in." And the last message read: "Stranger in the halls. Teacher says he has a knife. Don't come in." My heart sank, and for a second, I couldn't catch my breath. Immediately, I began walking from one classroom to another, trying the handles on every door, but there was nothing. That's when I heard the sound of sneakers scuffing across the tile floor at the other side of the hall. I knew I had to hide, but I didn't have many options, so I threw myself behind a row of lockers and tried to tuck my legs in. The footsteps grew closer. They had definitely made it into the section of the hallway when all of a sudden they stopped. I'll never forget the sound of his gravelly voice when he said, "Is that a leg I see?" I panicked. I heard the footsteps start up again, growing closer with each passing second. I had to make a decision. I ran across the lobby of the school and threw open the doors to the auditorium. I didn't hesitate. Fight or flight kicked in, and it's like my legs knew where to bring me before I could even think of it. I ran all the way to the stage and made my way behind the curtain. As I tucked myself behind the curtain, I heard the door to the auditorium slam closed. He was inside the room with me. The footsteps drew closer and closer, with each step growing louder. I began to look around for another place to run, when all of a sudden I heard the sound of a door opening behind me. When I looked, I was relieved to see one of the custodians. He was ushering me over to him, but kept one hand to his mouth as to tell me, "Stay quiet." As quickly and quietly as I could, I ran over to him and the two of us hid, locked in a supply closet for what felt like forever, as we heard the man pacing back and forth across the stage. After what felt like an eternity, but turned out to be only a couple of minutes, police arrived on the scene and the man fled. I had to give my statement to one of the officers, who told me I was lucky to have found the supply closet. Apparently, the man was carrying around a large hunting knife, and the other officer said he doesn't know what would have happened if I had been caught by him. I was sitting in my earth science class near the window, as I often did. I made it a point to get to all my classes early, so I could get the best seat. That day, I would regret choosing to sit near the window though, as it would turn into a day that I would never forget. So, I was just sitting there, doing my best to pay attention to the lesson, when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. I could have sworn that I saw something move near the tree line. When I looked again, I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, so I just decided to go back to paying attention to the teacher. That was when I noticed it again. Only this time when I looked, I noticed that there was a grown man standing beside one of the pine trees that lined the field. He was just standing there in what appeared to be a dirt-covered clothing and a ski cap. I thought it was odd, so I raised my hand in hopes to bring it to the attention of my teacher. However, when we all turned to look out the window, there was no one there. The teacher told me to stop fooling around and just pay attention, so I did. I tried my best to wipe the entire experience from my mind. I finished out the school day and made my way home. I only lived about a half a mile from my high school, so I would usually walk home. I could have taken the bus if I wanted to, but I enjoyed the walk. I didn't enjoy it that day though. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling like I was being watched. I tried my best not to be suspicious about it, but I slowly began increasing my walking speed. After what seemed like 10 times the usual distance, I finally made it home. And as soon as my house was in sight, I sprinted across my lawn and into my front door. I locked the door behind me and began to fill my mom in on my experience. She was quick to write it off as just me being on edge and assured me that everything was fine. I tried my best to agree with her on that, but something in my gut wouldn't let me settle down. After a very long day, it had finally hit 10 p.m., and it was time for me to go to sleep. But sleep never came. Instead, I kept tossing and turning in my bed. I could swear that I still felt someone watching me. After a couple of hours passed, I had begun to drift off, when out of the nowhere I heard what sounded like scratching on the glass. I immediately turned to my window, where I could swear I saw the edge of someone's shirt as they tucked themselves behind the wall. Before I could react, I heard my mom yelling for me. I leapt across my room and ran through my door, slamming closed as I passed. When I made it to my mom's room, she told me to close the door. After I did, with no questions asked, she said someone is outside of the house. My heart began to race. The police are on the way, just stay in here. My mom pulled out her phone and opened up the security camera. The man wasn't there anymore, but at a closer look, we could now see that my bedroom window has been opened. It wasn't long before the police arrived, though it felt like hours. By the time they got to my house, whoever it was had left. As I began to tell the police officers about the man I had seen at school earlier that day, he said that he and his partner would search the woods to see what they find. When they returned, I was horrified to find out they had found what they said was a homeless person's campsite. They said they also found a small journal with drawings of my classroom window, and at the last page, he had written, "It's time." To this day, no one knows who that man was or where he went. All I know is our dog has been sleeping in my room ever since.
This story happened my senior year of high school, which was about 5 years ago now. That year, they added this new room at the back part of the school. I can't remember the exact name they used for the room, but it was basically just an area with several computers and tables, and it was used for giving students extra help with school or making up tests and things like that. It had been made out of an old abandoned classroom that wasn't used for several years. At this time, I had been out of school for 2 days with an ear infection, and in that time, I missed a math test. When I returned to the math teacher, he allowed me to make up the test during study hall, so I went to that new room to take it. The teacher, Mr. Marcus, didn't want to have to go to the room and watch me take the test, so he let me go by myself and said he trusted me not to cheat. I walked all the way over to the room, which was pretty much on the complete opposite end of the school, and once I got to the room, I sat down and began the test. It wasn't too long of a test, but it was a really important one. Right when I got to the third question, the telephone in the room started ringing. I didn't want to get up and answer it, but I figured it was probably Mr. Marcus. I walked over and picked it up. When I did, I was told we were under a lockdown and there was a suspicious person in the building. I was scared being all by myself back in this room with nobody else there, and there wasn't even a classroom next to me I could go to, because this classroom was between 2 locker rooms for the gym, which was also nearby. I did what I was instructed to do and shut the door. As I did, I decided to take a quick look out into the hallway. It was completely empty and quiet as well. I went back in and decided to turn off the lights. I went out of sight of the door and went towards the back. Then I took out my phone and used the screen to give me some light to try to do more questions of the test. However, I couldn't really focus with us being in a lockdown. Suddenly, I heard the door to the room that I was in open. It was at that moment that I remembered I hadn't locked the door. Quickly, I ducked down underneath the table that I was at. I could see just barely from under the table a small amount of light coming in from the doorway and saw boots on the ground. At least they appeared to be boots, as I couldn't really see much. I was terrified, and I held my breath so that I wouldn't make a sound. Whoever was in there stood in the doorway for a while, and then the door shut. I barely heard footsteps walking into the room. I was literally shaking, trying not to make a sound. The room then went completely silent and remained that way. I slowly breathed in and out as quietly as I could. I was expecting at any moment to feel someone grab me from behind or something like that. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of a computer falling off a desk to the ground. Then I heard the noise of a man yelling and screaming. It seemed as though whoever was in this room had gone into a rage and was screaming and smashing things. I opened my eyes and looked over. I still couldn't really see anything, but I could hear where all the noise was coming from, and it was at the opposite end of the classroom to my left. I was terrified and knew I needed to get out of there. The exit was directly in front of me and to the right, and the noises were directly in front of me to the left, so I figured I had to make a run for it. I took a deep breath, and then got out from under the desk and ran as fast as I could, as whoever was in there continued to seemingly destroy things in the room. I ran forward to the door and was just barely able to see where I was going. I stumbled into a chair just before the door, but I was still able to make it out. I heard the man yelling as I left the room and sprinted down the hallway. I ran all the way to the front end of the school, where I saw a police officer. I yelled where the guy was and that he was destroying things. Another officer led me out of the school. After some time, I was able to calm down and they ended up catching the man. I got to go home right after that. I feel so lucky that I made it out of that room, because obviously whoever was in there was very dangerous. In my freshman year of high school, during the first semester, I had a civics class as my last class of the day. The school that I went to was pretty average size, I would say. I remember the class that I was in had about 20 kids in it. It was a couple of months into the school year at this point, and on this Thursday afternoon, we were all just listening to the teacher go through some announcements, when suddenly the phone in the classroom rang. The teacher, Mrs. Lindstrom, walked over and answered it. Then she hung up and told us all that the school was going under a lockdown. She seemed pretty serious and told us that this was not a drill. She locked her classroom door and then turned out the lights and instructed us to the back end of the classroom. We all got up from our desks and went to the back. There was a lot of whispering going on, but nobody seemed to know why we were under a lockdown. The longer we all sat back there, the more concerned everyone seemed to get, which made me start to worry. I started thinking of all the possibilities of what could be going on. It got really quiet after a while, and at one point we heard footsteps going down the hallway, but we didn't know whose they were. The lockdown went on for probably 30 more minutes before there was another call to the classroom announcing that the lockdown had been ended. We returned to class for the final 15 minutes or so, but the only thing on my mind was what could have caused it. School was dismissed after that, and I left school to get on my bus. When I got outside the school, I noticed several police cars with flashing lights. Everyone was talking about the lockdown, and I heard several rumors about what it was, but it wasn't until later that night where I got the real answer. My friend Robbie, whose mother worked at the school, told me that the lockdown had been caused by a student who claimed to see a strange man wandering the halls. However, after an extensive search of the school, one of the back doors was seen to be open, and it was determined that the man had left. The area was briefly searched, but the man was never found. The next day, when I went back to school, everything seemed to be pretty normal, and by the time I got to third hour, I had forgotten all about what had happened the day before. It was a Friday, so I was pretty much just excited to go to the football game that night. In the middle of my third hour class, which was history, I had to go to the bathroom. I knew the teacher was one of the nicer ones, who didn't require a pass or anything, so I just asked and she allowed me to go. I walked down the halls of the bathrooms, which are towards the end. As soon as I opened the door and got inside, I came face to face with a man who I had never seen before. He was wearing a winter hat and had long black hair and a small beard. He looked really surprised to see me. We both stood there staring at each other for a second or two. Then the man came towards me and I turned and ran. I ran back to class. When I got back, I told my teacher what I had seen, and the school once again went on another lockdown. This time we stayed locked down for over an hour. I was terrified, but finally it ended, and afterwards everyone was allowed to go home early. They told us the man had finally been caught, but what I don't understand is how they didn't find him the first time the school was locked down, and what he was doing inside there in the first place.
An 11-year-old child should never know the trauma of what occurred 7 Septembers ago. It was one day before spooky season, September 30th. I was babysitting my best friend's child, Dominic. I called him Dommy. I knew Dommy his whole life. I was even at the hospital when he was born. He called me Aunt Claire, short for Clarissa. I kept him once before, but it was short-lived. He was struck with a stomach bug, and I ended up taking him home. This time, though, Dami was healthier and happier than ever, excited to stay with me. I lived in a small cottage-style home with 3 bedrooms. It was located at the end of a spacey cul-de-sac, giving me the privacy that I craved. Behind my house, beyond the wooden fence, was hundreds of acres of wooded area, making for quiet nights. Back then, I really loved quiet nights. I remember the smell of spaghetti as Dami wolfed down 2 big bowls. I was really surprised at how much he ate. I was really proud that he loved my cooking and even sent a boastful text to his mom. He settled down in his pajamas and curled up on the couch. It was about 9 p.m. when I sat next to him. I was a part-time student with a full-time job, so I was really exhausted. I looked at Dami and I asked, "Well, is it time for bed yet?" "Maybe for you," he responded in a sassy, playful voice. I had a real sweet spot for Dami, and I still do. I allowed him to stay up a little bit longer, but I told him to be in bed by 10:30. He agreed and he continued watching his show. Shortly after, I went to my room and cracked the door. As tired as I was, I probably fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I remember having a bad dream before Dami woke me up by shaking my bed. He then let out an aggressive whisper, "Aunt Claire, wake up." I was startled so badly that I let out a yelp. "Yeah, baby, what's wrong?" I asked. I'm hungry," he said. He sounded strange, almost like he was frightened. "Hungry?" I asked. "You ate 2 big bowls of spaghetti." "I know." He paused and looked at me with frightened eyes. "I want more." Looking back, I'm really ashamed to say that I was upset with him and that I took an angry tone. No, I'm not a morning person, and certainly not a wake me up in the middle of night person. "Dami, it's nearly midnight. You promised to be in bed. Call it a night and I'll make you some breakfast in the morning." I jerked the blankets and then rolled over, shutting my eyes. Not 10 seconds passed before he shook the bed again, whispering, "I really need a bowl of spaghetti. Right now." I turned over, not believing how difficult he was being. He had never misbehaved like this and was always polite. I stared at him in disbelief. "Fine," I said, crawling out of bed. I walked with him through the dark house to the kitchen. Before we could make it to the fridge, he grabbed my wrist. He stared at me with tears in his eyes. His little body trembled and squatted down. "What's wrong, Dami?" And he then whispered something that shook my core. "There's a man in your bedroom. He's under your bed." "What? No," I said in disbelief. "No one's under my bed." "There is. I don't want him to know that I know. I had to get you in here." As Dami finished his sentence, we then heard a rustling down the hallway, the noise coming from my room. We were both paralyzed in fear. We had no idea what to do. Dami began crying, which boosted me into action. I scooped him up and unlocked the back door. I jetted and entered the pitch-black backyard. Once I was out there, holding Dami, my heart dropped as I came to a realization. My cell phone was on the dresser, next to my bed. As quickly as I could, I then ran with Dami right through a side gate and into the front yard. I stubbed my toe on something. I can still remember how terribly it hurt, but I kept moving. I saw my destination down the street, my closest neighbor. Their garage door was open, and I saw the silhouette of a man inside of it. It was the longest, most terrifying run of my life. There was nothing but blackness around me as my bare feet ran on the pavement. I almost expected to be tackled by the intruder that was inside my house, but I wasn't. I made it to my neighbor's house and called the police. The police came, lights and sirens. They checked inside my house, but they didn't find the intruder. They did, however, find that my bedroom window was wide open. The strange man likely fled into the woods after hearing Dami and I's conversation. To this day, I don't know who was under my bed or how or when they got there. For a really long time, I convinced myself that it was my crazy ex-boyfriend Drew from a few years back. But I changed my mind after running into Drew at an Olive Garden, where he then introduced me to his wife. I dream of different endings to my experience. Oftentimes I wake up in a trembling sweat because Dami and I were killed violently. I don't sleep much anymore. Dami's mom and I aren't as close as we used to be. We only text when I ask how Dami's doing. She says that Dami still loves me, but he'll never ever stay with me again. And I can't say I blame him. This happened.
When I was around 7 years old, my family and I moved into an old house. It was a really big house with 4 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 2 living rooms, and even had a dumbwaiter. It was at least 80 years old and was in pretty good condition for a house that old. My parents both worked 12-hour shifts at a hospital and would oftentimes have to get a sitter for me. My current babysitter, who I looked up to dearly, had moved away over 2,000 miles to another state to start her career in law. Needless to say, I wasn't doing well because of it. She had been with us for over 6 years and even considered her as family. Anyway, with her now gone, my parents had to look for a new babysitter. We had lived in a town where there weren't many sitters, meaning there was a better chance for them to have low reviews. Thankfully, we had found one who lived in walking distance that had 4-star reviews, which wasn't bad but still convenient. Her name was Sandra, and she seemed really nice. She was 24, attended college, and was apparently really good with kids. We'd play games together, she'd help me with my homework, watch TV, etc. My parents got along well with her, and as the weeks went by with her as my new babysitter, I started to see her a lot like my previous one. While all of this was great for both my parents and I, something happened during a visit that would change my whole perspective of her. It was a Friday night, and my parents were on a weekend trip to the Bahamas for their anniversary, and I was with Sandra. She had bought me some pizza and sat down with me to watch SpongeBob to keep me company. We watched for about an hour or so before she tells me to get ready for bed. Now, I was never the rebellious type of kid, so I complied and went up to bed to go to sleep. I fall asleep almost instantly and probably slept for a good 2 hours or so when I woke up to a steady banging noise. It was pretty loud, especially from my room, and kind of sounded like someone hitting a hammer against a wooden door. I turn on my light and quietly tiptoe down the stairs to the living room where the noise was coming from. I descend into the living room where the light was on, and what I saw next will forever stay with me. Sandra had been facing the back door while forcefully hitting her head on it. On the floor was a small puddle of blood that was coming from her nose, as well as blood dripping down the door. Being only 7, I tried to process as to what I was seeing, but I was just simply petrified. I let out a loud scream across the house and got on the house phone to dial 911. I spoke with the operator, trying my best to describe what it was that I was seeing. All the while, I'm screaming at Sandra to please stop, but she didn't seem to care or acknowledge me. I'm still on the phone with the police, giving them my address and to please come as soon as possible. The police heard the banging in the background and arrived in minutes with 3 officers restraining Sandra. She tried to resist no matter what, leaving one of the officers with no choice but to tase her. They called for an ambulance, and one of the officers called my parents, letting me know the situation. That night, my aunt came to stay with me at her house until my parents got back. As for Sandra, she had been rushed to the hospital where she regained consciousness and suffered from severe injuries. According to my parents, Sandra doesn't remember any of it or what had happened. All she remembered was her on the couch with her phone when she felt dizzy and got up until everything went black. Till this day, it's still unclear as to what had happened that day or what it was. Either way, it's one of the most horrifying encounters I've ever witnessed. This is a story that happened to me when I was around 24 years old. I recently moved to Boston for an internship to help prepare for my field of study since I had just graduated from school. However, it wasn't a paid internship, and the money I did make was from my disability insurance. This meant that I had to find a job in order to make income. After days of searching for jobs, I finally found one as a part-time babysitter. I was good with children and figured babysitting wouldn't be bad for a first job. However, little did I know that those expectations were far from true. Ever since I had moved, I had babysat for a while now and have dealt with many different kids, but this kid takes the prize. I won't disclose personal information about her, but we'll call her Rachel. Rachel was around 9 and was this small blonde girl who was obsessed with dolls. She basically liked any type of dolls. Antique dolls, rag dolls, Barbie dolls, you name it. One time, I had babysat for her for 2 days as her parents would be out of town. She was nice, but wasn't very talkative and just mainly played with her dolls and tended to them. I would be staying in the guest bedroom, and, of course, there were dolls. I remember this one porcelain doll sitting on a chair beside the bed I'd be sleeping in. It was a very unnerving doll, the type where it felt like you were being watched by it whenever you moved. I thought nothing of it and just got ready for bed and made sure Rachel was asleep. It was around 11 p.m. and I had got ready for bed and went to sleep with ease. I'd say I slept for a good hour or so before waking up to the sound of something in the room. I wake up and take a look at the clock and saw that it was 1 a.m. The second I turned on the light, I take a look around the room and see that the doll's head had been rotated backwards. Thinking it was probably Rachel pulling a joke, I turned the doll's head and went over to her room. However, Rachel seemed to be fast asleep and didn't seem like she had gotten out of bed. I shut her door and go back to my room, and the doll had now fallen off the chair. I didn't even dare touch it and just shut the door and slept on the couch. When morning came, I wasn't gonna bother Rachel with questions about the doll, so I ignored it and waited for the parents to arrive. I got paid and left the house and refused to babysit for Rachel again. When they did call me, I simply declined and claimed that I had gotten another job. I haven't experienced anything paranormal like that again, and I have moved past it. This story has shocked me to my core ever since, and I've even developed a fear of dolls. Whenever I see one, I always walk away. When I was about 11, my family and I moved into a new home in Los Angeles. It wasn't anything too big, just a one-storied home appropriate for a family of 3. I attended a private school in the city and was a naturally socially awkward child. This will be important in the story later. I'd also like to mention that I have autism, meaning it was hard for me to make friends and interact with others. Both my parents were fully aware of this and had made me go through therapy and other medication to help me with it. While it did improve a little bit, I still had some challenges I had to deal with. Anyway, we had moved to Cali as my dad had other work there with a higher salary. This meant that he'd most of the time be working and not at the house. I mean, my mom would sometimes watch over me, but she worked too and would sometimes have to get a babysitter. My current babysitter, who I adored, had recently moved over 2,000 miles away for a better job. It was sad, but that was the reality, and we had to find another sitter. Eventually, my mom had found me a new sitter who wasn't like the old one, but was still manageable. Her name was Luna, and she claimed to be just 19 years old. She was nice, but had a few issues that I began to take notice from for the first few visits. While it wasn't anything too concerning, they were very much noticeable. At first, it was relatively minor things like twitching and loss of focus. However, these things began to turn into bigger problems, all the way from talking to herself to sometimes asking me weird questions. I could only assume that she had some sort of disorder and remembered feeling sympathy toward her. The first night I met Luna was when both of my parents had their anniversary and another time where they both had work. I'd say these tics didn't arise until the third visit of babysitting where I started to take notice. But the more she babysat me, the worse the tics would get. It wasn't until one night, though, where she did something that really pushed the limit. It was Valentine's Day of 2014, and my parents had gone out in the city for a nice dinner. This meant that I would be home with Luna until they got back. For the first hour, she helped me with my homework, and then we played a game. Things went well for the most part, and even though I barely interacted with her, I wasn't rude. I remember giving her a hard time when it was my bedtime that night. It was stupid of me, but keep in mind, I was an 11-year-old boy that didn't want to sleep. Eventually, however, I ended up complying and went to sleep without any problems. Looking back, however, I'd say I slept for a good few hours or so before I awoke to my bedroom door being opened. Thinking it was just a draft, I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. However, that was when I hear my door open a little more and there was someone standing in the corner of my room. The figure then slowly walks over toward me, coming to a complete stop. At first, I couldn't see who it was, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, my light from my nightlight revealed Luna standing at the edge of my bed. I turn on my light and Luna immediately apologizes, telling me she's sorry and that she tends to sleepwalk. In her hand was one of my dad's power drills with the battery taken out. She went on with more excuses while trying to tell two separate stories about why she had it. Of course, being only 11, I had my suspicions, but it wasn't enough to see her as a threat. Later that night, my parents had come home and paid her. It wasn't until the next morning where I woke up and told my parents about Luna and what she did. They, of course, flip out and attempted to call Luna multiple times. My mom had also found empty bottles of her prescription medication gone. However, Luna denies any wrongdoing, and police couldn't actually do anything since she technically didn't commit a crime. It all makes no sense, and it doesn't till this day. Luna never babysat for me again after that, and I hope I never see or hear from her again. I still will never know for sure what she was planning on doing with that power drill, and it still haunts me from time to time.
I'm a 17-year-old girl who would babysit for a family I knew well. My younger sister was friends with the little boy from the family. We'll call him Chris for privacy reasons. I was really close with Chris's younger sister, Lily, which is the main reason their mother had asked me to babysit for them. I was honestly excited, as I really enjoyed spending time with Lily, and Chris too. Their mom was going out to dinner with friends, and she wouldn't be home until much later in the night. The night of babysitting approached, and everything had been fine. I'd been playing some Minecraft with the two of them for quite a while, and later ordered a pizza for us all to share. Eventually 9 p.m. approached, and it was the kids' bedtime. The excitement must have wiped them out, because they didn't fight me at all on the curfew. Once they were both asleep in their rooms, I sat on the couch in the living room and watched Netflix. Behind the living room was the staircase leading to the upstairs, so from where I was sitting, I could see if someone went upstairs. I was about halfway into an episode of my show when I then heard footsteps coming from down the stairs, assuming it was either Chris or Lily. I called out both of their names. No answer. I had guessed I either imagined it or it was just one of them getting up to use the bathroom or something. I continued to watch my show until I saw something in the reflection of the grandfather clock right next to the TV. There was a faint outline of a little girl leaning over the railing of the stairs. I was relaxed initially, as I figured it was just Lily who had woken up. I turned from the couch to look at the stairs, only to be met with an empty staircase. There was nobody there. I whipped my head back around to face the grandfather clock, and the reflection was gone. I felt my stomach plummet, and my heartbeat started to spike. Unnerved, I paused the TV and looked back at the staircase. Nothing. Maybe the reflection had just been from the TV and I had been mistaken. That was the only plausible explanation. The only way I was going to find out for sure, though, is if I checked both kids. Reluctantly, I got up and I walked up the staircase. I opened the door to Chris's room to find him sound asleep. I then made my way over to Lily's room, only to find her asleep as well. I walked further into her room just to double check if she was really fully asleep, and she was. My heart still racing. I was simply left confused. What the hell had I seen in the reflection if Lily was genuinely asleep? I turned to leave the room, only to stop dead in my tracks. There was a girl standing in the hallway. A girl who definitely wasn't Lily. She was sickeningly pale and wearing a white nightgown. I felt like my heart was going to come up my throat. Frozen in fear, it took a few seconds to come back to reality and then slam the door and lock it. I just stood there leaning against the door for a solid minute, heart racing, breathing heavy. That's when I then heard a knock on the door, and I jumped, screaming bloody murder. "Hey, it's just me," I heard Chris say from the other side of the door. A huge wave of relief then washed over me, and I opened the door. He had just stared at me, watching me in this unnerved state, with wide eyes and a concerned look. "What's wrong?" he asked me. Lily had woken up as well, sitting up in bed with a confused expression. I didn't want to scare either of them, so I lied. "I was just watching a scary movie downstairs when I came up to check on you guys, and I guess I was just caught off guard. Sorry for waking you." They both went back to bed, and I returned back downstairs to try and become calm again. I resumed my TV show. I was reaching the end when I suddenly had the urge to look in the reflection once again. Big mistake. I looked back, only to see the clear face of a young girl, the one from the hallway. I paused my show immediately and sprung off the couch. I sprinted out of the house and went out to my car, locking the doors. With shaking hands, I called my mom and then told her everything that happened. She sounded skeptical, and I'm still unsure to this day if she believes me, but she then insisted that I don't leave Chris or Lily alone. I really didn't want to leave them, but I didn't want to be in the house with this ghost either. After talking on the phone, my mom agreed to stay on the phone with me while I stayed there until their mother had come back home. After that night, their mother had asked me to babysit again, but I turned her down politely. It's not that I didn't like the kids. There was just no way in hell I was going to deal with that again. I had decided to do some research on the history of the house to see if I was simply delusional or if there was in fact a paranormal presence in the house. And to my horror, I'd found an article about the house where a little girl had passed away from pneumonia. She had passed away in what was currently Lily's room, and it was the same exact face that I'd seen in the reflection of the grandfather clock. Hell no.
Babysitting wasn't the job that I had imagined having while I was a senior in high school. I was paid a decent rate by the hour for watching kids that only needed to have an adult around while their parents were out. I know exactly what you're thinking. Why would you willingly waste your time watching children when you could have been working retail or some other halfway decent job? Am I close? Well, as you can imagine, the majority of kids I've looked after were happy, normal children, but my sister's children, let me get to that. Here's a little background just to help you better understand why I don't foresee myself having children anytime soon, if ever. I'm a male and a social outcast at that. I was 16 when my mom told me that I'd be babysitting for my older sister. Naturally, I shrugged it off as it were no big deal because, what's the worst that could happen, right? My sister needed to go out of town on a business trip for 2 days, which then caused my mom to decide that I was the right candidate for the job. I learned very quickly that kids are hungry literally every 5 minutes, and they have no respect for the babysitter, and they are totally out of control without their parents around. That was a bummer. Kids are perceived as sweet, innocent, and all-around pure, yet I have first-hand experience on just how truly creepy some kids can be. I have been around my nieces and nephews dozens of times before, so there wasn't any reason for me to think that they were a bit peculiar, aside from the fact that I walked in on Nat, short for Natalie, attempting to sacrifice her sister to the devil in order to bargain for immortality by shoving Lux's hand into a blender. Luckily, I was able to pry her away from the blender before she could turn it on. I had been watching them for less than 20 minutes when that incident occurred. Fast forward to this first afternoon, the kids were playing in the toy room, so I decided to watch television before doing my homework. I was in the middle of a funny movie when Mike cut the side of my neck with scissors. He drew a pentagram on the floor with ketchup, chanted something in a language that I didn't recognize, they probably made it up, and locked Jay in the basement. Tony was the good kid who explained that Mike was trying to summon a demon, someone that is close to the devil so that he could bargain Jay's soul for immortality. Mike angrily hissed at me when the plan didn't work. I swear to God, those freaking creepypastas they watch really don't help them. It was then that I learned that they had a crazy obsession with vampires. The need to be immortal and trying to draw blood from people is their way to fulfill the desire to be like the people in movies or books. These kids were actually trying to figure out ways that they could become immortal without having to stay so small for all of eternity. I thought that was a bit unhealthy. I still have no idea how the internet or horror movies, when their parents weren't looking, really activated this, but I'm honestly still scared of what could have happened. Nat was the eldest child. She was the bad influence on her siblings. She was the entire reason why everything went down on the second night. I was studying for a calculus test that I had the next day. The kids were supposed to be playing in the backyard, which was the mistake. All I really remember about studying is that I had been exhausted from chasing around those brats the night before because I ended up falling asleep at the kitchen table. I woke up sometime in the afternoon with my hands and feet tied to a metal pipe in the basement, while my deranged nieces and nephews stood over me with a weird look in their eyes. I struggled for a good 10 minutes to free myself from that stupid rope as they chanted some weird language again. I assumed that they were really trying to sacrifice me, however, I was relieved when I saw one of the cats knock a candle off the windowsill. The carpet and lengthy silk curtains immediately caught fire, which caused the kids to untie me. We rushed out of the house and to safety just in time to watch the house burn, literally to the ground. I stood motionless for what seemed like hours before eventually the police were called by the neighbors. I called my mom to come get the kids before being questioned by police for over 3 hours. The detective that was interrogating me surely was about to arrest me, but the fire department later ruled that the fire was an accident. My sister angrily barged into my room once she arrived home and informed me that I was no longer allowed to babysit her kids again, and literally almost beat me senseless if it wasn't for my parents stopping her fury. I cried tears of joy at the news and never babysat again. I tried to explain the story to both the detectives and my family, though my nieces and nephews' stories all apparently corroborated against my own, and there was nothing I could do. Needless to say, I never visited their family again, both by being shunned and by choice. Natalie and the other kids all grew out of the vampire phase from what I heard once they hit junior high and acquired less creepy, less dangerous interests. I'm 28 years old now, incredibly far away from my family, married to the most amazing woman, yet I still refuse to think about having children. You never know what they're going to get into.
This happened to me in 2014, on my way to my great-grandparents' house in Goose Creek, South Carolina. We had left in the late morning around 11 a.m. to try and get there before dinner. Our whole reason behind going was for a cruise vacation my great-grandmother had paid for. It was going to be me, my mother, my father, my aunt, my other aunt, my great-grandfather, and my great-grandmother, along with a few other friends of my GGMs. In the car, it was my mother and I, along with most of our luggage. My father was coming a few days later due to work stuff, so we decided to drive out that day to get there early and catch up on family drama and the usual. My mother had just finished packing the car, and she called me down the stairs to get in the car with my bag of entertainment things. I came rushing down, excited to go on a road trip and to see my family since, at that time, they hadn't caused many of the problems that push us apart today. We started our drive on some scenic back roads before getting towards the inner city and hopping onto the highway. In this story, I'm only 7, so I'm still blissfully naive and unaware of many things in the world. I'm also fuzzy on the details of the persons involved, so the descriptions of the clothing and whatnot may be a bit skewed. I was mainly focused on Minecraft and collecting Beanie Boos at the time, rather than the dangers of reality and strange people. After about 2 hours of us being on the road, I told my mom I needed the bathroom. I had drunk about 2 water bottles and my bladder was complaining. Since we were still near the busy city area, there were plenty of gas stations and corner stores we could stop at. My mom asked if I was hungry as well, to which I excitedly said yes, since this meant that I got junk food, which I didn't get often. So we pulled off at an exit, and came across a Quick Trip not long after. I was bouncing out of my seat with excitement, ready to grab my favorite chips and candy and a sugary drink, which I knew my mom would later regret letting me have. We got out of the car, my mom grabbed her purse, and we headed inside to the bathrooms. My mom waited outside patiently for me to use the restroom, and after a few minutes I came out, and we walked around grabbing snacks and drinks. I grabbed dill pickle Lays, Rolo candies, Cheetos, some sausage sticks, beef jerky, and a Sprite and water from the cooler sections. My mom had a handful of things as well, and we went up to the counter and stood in line. While waiting to check out, I counted the cars in the parking lots and how many of each brand there were since I was super obsessed with cars back then. My mom tugged my arm a bit as the line moved up, so I followed her like the clingy 7-year-old I was. We got up to the counter, greeted the cashier, paid for our things, and left with 2 bags of snacks and drinks. I was giddy with a big grin on my face the whole time, knowing that I would be set for the rest of the trip with my rare treats. As we finished up at the counter, a black man in a red Nike hoodie, black sweatpants, black shoes, and sunglasses came into the station. I took particular notice of him because of the fact he was wearing sunglasses indoors. He walked casually up to the counter with a warm smile on his face and rested his arms on the counter. My mom noticed him as well and gave him the short, hey smile that you give strangers when you don't want to start a conversation. He didn't notice and looked over at the cashier. This is when things went south, real quick. The man playfully smacked the counter and said in a friendly tone, "Give me all your money." The cashier looked at him confused, since the man acted like he knew the cashier. The guy gave the cashier a few seconds before becoming serious, slamming his hands on the counter, pulling out a gun, and demanding money again. This time he was serious, and his demand was no longer a joke. My mom began to drag me out of the store, while I stared in confusion and almost awe at what was happening before me. She threw me into the car, not literally, but you know what I'm getting at, and quickly sped out of the parking lot. The last thing I saw of the gas station was the man putting his gun to the back of the cashier's head and yelling something inaudible to him. It's been 7 years now since this incident, and gas stations still give me a nervous, angsty vibe. Last I saw and heard, the QT had been torn down, and a new building erected in its place. I know, not the dramatic, chaotic ending some of you might have hoped for, but it was still a scary and traumatic experience for me, so I thought I might share it and see if anyone else has experienced the same or knows anything more about the incident.
I'm a 23-year-old female from the UK. When I was 18, I lived very close to a Starbucks coffee shop. It was only about 15 minutes away on foot. During this time, I had pretty bad anxiety issues due to trauma, and part of my therapy treatment was to go out for walks on my own when it was a little dark outside. I wouldn't put myself in dangerous situations or do anything stupid, but I had to get over my irrational fear of being alone outside at night. It's important to note that this story takes place when it was about 9 p.m. in the late summer months. I can't really remember if it was July or August, but it was right around that time. I guess around the time it is now. It didn't get dark until about 10:30 to 11 p.m. Anyway, the Starbucks closed at 8 p.m., and right behind it where the car park was, there was a small hotel and a gas station next to it. There was also a gas station across the street which sort of rivaled the other one. This is relevant to the story. I don't want to name the hotel or gas stations for privacy reasons, just in case someone could sleuth and figure out where this took place. I was out for a walk, and I wanted to challenge myself to stay out until at least 9:30 p.m., then I'd walk home. I don't have a lot of mobile data on my phone, but the Starbucks provided free Wi-Fi even when closed. So I ended up in one of the seating areas outside so that I could scroll through social media on my phone, and it made me feel calmer, since I felt apprehensive about being out at night on my own. I sat there for a while, just minding my own business. Now, the car park was deserted. The gas station was close by and obviously had cars pulling in and out, but the customers over there couldn't see me because of the layout of everything around me. I was on my phone when suddenly I heard a loud shouting coming from the hotel. I looked up, and it was like my brain couldn't comprehend what was happening, because I sat there frozen as I watched two older men hanging out their window shouting at me. It took me a second to understand what the hell was happening, and I was horrified. They were screaming at me, trying to get my attention, saying things like,
"Hey, why don't you come over here, baby?"
Like I said, I have major anxiety issues about being out at night, especially on my own, and I was really trying to resolve those issues. I was so scared that I immediately grabbed my rucksack and got up, not even tucking the chair back into the table that I'd sat at, and I started speed walking out of the car park towards the gas station. One of the men disappeared, and the other screamed at me,
"You need to come up to our room."
After hearing this, my heart was pounding. I immediately called a family member, and I was almost crying from fear. I was only 18 years old. Yes, I was considered an adult in my country, but I still felt like a dumb teenager in a lot of ways. As a female, being accosted by these men who were insulting me and then demanding I come up to their room, well, I just knew they clearly had very bad intentions. I didn't go into the gas station because I felt unsafe, and I decided to cross the street to the other side and then go into the station over there instead. This is because my mom actually worked there, and I felt much safer going to her, where I knew she and her colleagues could protect me. The relative I was on the phone with told me to call the police, but I was way too afraid to hang up the phone, and I begged her to stay on the line with me. She agreed and tried to calm me down, telling me to go across the street. When I was crossing, I looked behind me, and the men were now following me. I couldn't believe what was happening. They looked to be in their late 20s, early 30s, and I definitely looked my age, if not younger. I took off running, not even caring if I got hit by a car, because I just knew I had to get the f away from them. I didn't dare look behind me, just in case they were running after me. I flew into the gas station and immediately ran to the cash register, and I then told my mom what was happening. One of the people working with her that night was a man who I'll call Jason. Jason was really stocky and tall, built like a tank, as it's commonly called in my country. My mom ushered me into the bathroom and told me to stay there and lock the door. Jason heard everything, and he ran out the door and into the forecourt to find the men. I was crying in relief now because I finally felt safe. My mom and a lady she worked with had tried to comfort me. Jason came back in after a few minutes, and he said the men had ran away as soon as they saw him coming. I really don't know what those men intended to do. Following me into a place people would see them seems really stupid on their part, but I know they had very bad intentions. Jason walked my mom and I home, and we never saw the men again. I assumed they just went back to the hotel. After that experience, I didn't want it to be a setback, so a week later, I walked back to that Starbucks at 9 p.m. and stood looking at the hotel. I knew that the men would have likely moved on by that point, and I needed to do that to prove to myself that I would be okay. I've dealt with my anxiety issues now, and I'm glad this experience didn't make it worse for me. It was really terrifying at the time, and I still think about it sometimes. I just know they had something horrific planned for me. I wonder just how long they watched me sitting on my phone. I'm now always aware of my surroundings, and I never get so immersed in anything that I lose sight of those around me. For all I know, they could have watched me the whole time. They could have snuck up on me, grabbed me, and done God knows what. I was really lucky they were dumbasses and decided to scream at me instead. Please stay safe, everyone, and don't make the same mistake I did. Always be aware of your surroundings, and if you find yourself in a scary situation, don't panic. Go to somewhere safe and call the police. You never know where the predators are lurking.
I work at a gas station in New Zealand, and despite the downside of dealing with difficult customers, I have genuinely always loved my job. The station I started at has a lot of homeless people or individuals who are struggling financially, even if they do have a home. One homeless man in particular has become my stalker. When I first started, my coworkers informed me that this man would come in and we would give him a free cup of hot water, which he would add some sugar sachets to. They mentioned that he's a bit strange but generally harmless, except for his tendency to swear frequently. Since he was homeless, I felt sorry for him, especially during the winter when I first heard about him, so I happily provided him with his water. However, this man wouldn't just take the water and leave. He would go on rants about all sorts of nonsense, and I could never understand what he was talking about. He used the F word every other word and spoke gibberish in between. Some of my coworkers stopped serving him as he disturbed other customers, but one other coworker and I continued to do so. Looking back, this is probably where the problem started, because he began only coming in when I was working alone. I worked from 2 p.m. to 11 p.m., and he would always show up at night. He never came on my days off, which varied each week, so he must have observed and noted my work schedule by passing by during the day, which I noticed him doing often. Over time, I started feeling uncomfortable with his presence and the way he looked at me. However, being raised in a Christian family, I was reluctant to turn him away. My grandfather always told me as a child, "Manners are cheap, and never turn your back on charity." So I continued to serve him. But then he started making comments about my appearance, then my body, and he stopped asking for water. He just wanted me. He would come in, head straight towards me, and linger in the store for what felt like hours. The final straw came when he winked at me and said I always had a friend in him. The way he said it sent chills down my spine. So I decided to stop letting him in. The moment I was working alone, I locked the doors because I knew he would appear. The problem was, I knew he was watching me. I could sense it, and as soon as the last customer left the forecourt, he would approach the doors. I caught him watching me multiple times a day from alleyways and bushes. We got him trespassed, hoping it would solve the issue. Unfortunately, it didn't. He would still watch me, try to get in, and yell at me through the doors when I refused to let him in. I called the police every time he showed up, but he managed to escape each time. This went on for months on end. I was scared 24/7 at work and even had nightmares at home. There were countless incidents of harassment, attempted entries, and sightings of him watching me. But the worst one occurred when I was on forecourt duty, filling cars and cleaning the pumps. We have speakers at all pumps that are connected to an intercom inside, allowing us to communicate with customers without having to run outside. It's a large site with 12 pumps. While I was outside, I heard my coworker call me inside through the speakers, her voice filled with panic. Since it was daytime, my initial thought was that a customer was causing trouble. I quickly went inside and immediately heard the doors lock behind me. "Look over there by the bushes," she said with wide eyes. I turned to look, and there he was, peering in. The scariest part? He had one foot lunged forward, as if he was ready to run and attack the moment the doors opened. My heart sank, and I called the police, who arrived remarkably quickly. They were already there as I hung up the phone. The officer taking my statement informed me that he would be charged with criminal harassment, and a restraining order was in place. However, legally they had to issue a warning before he could be arrested, and he was released the same night. But enough was enough. I couldn't handle it anymore. I was constantly terrified. It wasn't a matter of if he would return, but when. The very next day, I handed in my 2 weeks' notice. Management didn't want to lose me and offered me a transfer to a site far away where he would never find me, or so we thought. I accepted the transfer, and the new site was great. All the staff were instructed not to disclose my new location to anyone, including the regular customers. They were told to say that I no longer worked for the company. For about 3 months, everything was peaceful. There was no sign of my stalker, and I felt safe. I no longer had to constantly look over my shoulder. However, the relief didn't last long. Just a month ago, the officer handling my case informed me that I had to appear in court and testify against him. I was terrified of seeing him again, but I convinced myself it was for the best. I had just come to terms with the fact that I could do it, and I would ensure he was held accountable. But then the worst happened. He found me at the new site. I don't know how he did it, but my best guess is that he asked a new employee at my old site, someone who wasn't aware of him, the stalking and the restraining order, and they told him. He must have taken a bus or made a remarkably long walk. He was approaching the doors quickly when I spotted him, and I ran away in a panic. I nearly knocked over my boss, who saw the fear on my face and asked what was wrong. In my state of shock and fear, I can't even remember what I said, but my manager locked us in her office and provided incredible support. She called the police and handled everything. I was trembling and in shock. We all believed I was safe at the new site, as the police officer in charge had assured us he would never find me there. While we were on the phone with the police, we witnessed him circling the site at least 3 times before the police arrived, apprehended him, and placed him under arrest. Thank God. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep for the next few days as I waited for the court date. The fear of him being released was overwhelming. 2 days before the court hearing, I prayed. I prayed that he would be convicted and that I would be safe. I honestly had no idea what I would do if he was released and knew where to find me again. This might sound dramatic, but anyone who has experienced the trauma of being stalked will understand. I even made the comment, "If he gets away, I think I'll kill myself." I genuinely felt that hopeless. Thankfully, my prayers were answered the next day when the officer handling my case called me. "I've got some good news. He changed his plea to guilty." I was at work, and I jumped up and down in front of customers. This is the safest I have felt in nearly a year, which has been the longest year of my life. But for now, it's over. Well, mostly. I have a sentencing case coming up, where the duration of his sentence will be determined. But for now, I can finally relax, knowing this monster is off the streets and, most importantly, unable to come near me. Deep down, I know it's not truly over. My gut tells me that when he's released, he'll come back. This man is obsessed and mentally ill. The only thing keeping me going is the saying, "Don't borrow trouble before it shows up at your doorstep." But that's the problem. I know he'll be back at my doorstep as soon as he can. Last night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from Universal Studios in Orlando. We were rerouted a way home we've never went before, and we're traveling in basically the middle of nowhere. My boyfriend's speedometer is broken on his car, and he has to press the button to reset the miles after he gets gas. This will be very important soon. We were driving on a deserted road in the middle of absolute nowhere without a single car in sight. My boyfriend realized we hit the 130-mile mark on his odometer. We needed gas, but there was literally not one gas station in sight. I put search gas stations nearby, and we found one. It turned out to be closed. In a hurry, we found another gas station 5 minutes up the road. This is where the story gets weird. My boyfriend thought he closed his gas cap and we're once again driving along this deserted road. We heard a loud bang and he realized he forgot to put the gas cap back on, so we're driving around this dark road looking for the gas cap. He finally pulls over and realizes somehow the gas cap is still attached to the car. We get back on track to the other gas station. Out of nowhere, I had a horrible thought about something going wrong at that gas station. I pushed it aside because I knew we needed gas and AAA is not an option where we were at the moment. We get to this gas station and the lights are kind of on. This road literally leads to a dead end with a gas station on it. The only way to leave this area was to turn left or go straight out of the gas station. My boyfriend got out of the car to see if we could get gas and the feeling intensified. I have literally never felt like that in my life. My stomach dropped into my butt. I have been in very disturbing situations such as almost being kidnapped twice, being followed home, watching someone be taken away in a body bag after being hit by a car, and even a paranormal situation. But I have never felt like this before. I saw a white car pulling up to the road to make a left. Keep in mind, there is literally no one on this road. He pulls up and notices my boyfriend and backs up with his windows down. I found this very strange because my boyfriend has a very nice sports car, and my mind immediately went into panic mode. I started screaming his name, and the man realized that someone else was in the car, turned left and sped off. Sadly, I didn't get his license plate because of how dark it was. This situation frightened me more than you can even imagine. It may not seem too scary, but it was easily one of the most terrifying things to watch, because I didn't know if I was going to witness my boyfriend being robbed at gunpoint or something like that. The feeling and thought I had just 10 minutes earlier is what also made the situation even worse. We found a gas station with actual human life around, and we made it home safe and sound. Once I got home, my dad told me that the road we were driving on was famous for the many bodies being found on it. I hope no one ever gets put into this situation. And to the man who was planning to do something to my boyfriend, let's never meet.
This happened to me when I was 19. For some context, I'm a guy. I was working at my overnight job at a 24-hour gas station, and it was about 1 in the morning, and I was just sitting at the register minding my own business when this guy walks in. He approached the counter, and he had asked for a guy that he knows. Keep in mind, I know that guy as well. I know the guy that came up to the counter as a former classmate that I graduated with, and I told him the guy he was asking for wasn't there. He said that I was lying. Then he took out a gun and pointed it right at me. He then told me to tell him where he's at, or he's opening fire. I once again told him that he wasn't here. Then he actually came behind the counter and put the gun right up to my head, then saying,
"Tell me where he is, or you die."
Also, keep in mind that the guy who had the gun to my head was someone from school that everyone couldn't stand. I was just frozen. I didn't know what to do. I told him for the 3rd time that he wasn't here and that I don't know where the hell he's at. My heart was racing to what felt like 1,000,000 miles a second. Then thankfully, a cop walked inside the gas station surprisingly and then screamed at the guy to drop the gun and step away with his hands up. The guy was arrested. After this happened, I immediately ran to the bathroom to take the biggest shit I probably ever have in my life. I know that's not the point, but I felt such relief after it was all over. After I finished up in the bathroom, I went to the counter and I thanked the officer for taking care of that guy. My boss saw how scared I was, and they said I could leave for the night if I wanted to for my safety. So that's what I did. I clocked out, and I then went home safe and sound. I quit that job the very next day. I told the guy from school about our classmate with the gun and what happened. He was really glad that I didn't tell him where he was, because apparently they had some really bad blood. Needless to say, I'm never working overnights again.
One of the most chilling moments of my whole life was while working at 7-Eleven. Some guy walks in wearing a suit, staggers over to one of the fridges and grabs a ton of those Starbucks cold brews out of one of them before dumping them all on the counter in front of me. The stink of booze off of him was just wild, and as I'm ringing him up, I asked if he'd either had a really good day or a really bad one. He's let out this really hearty laugh and then tells me, "A little of both." He then goes on to explain that he'd just gotten out of court, and that he's been acquitted of accidentally shooting one of his hunting buddies on a trip that happened a few years ago. I was so stunned that I didn't really know what to say. I just went with the first thing that came to mind, which was, "I'm sorry." He laughs again, shakes his head, and then asks me, "You know what the funniest thing is, though?" I shake my head, taking the 10 he gave me before grabbing his change from the register, and when he tells me, I swear I almost dropped his money all over the floor when he spoke. He tells me, "It was no accident." Then just starts laughing to himself while he pockets the change and scoops up all the cold brews from the counter. I was so taken aback that all I could do was just stand there, watching the guy as he walked out of the store and towards his parked car. Then my mind switches to thinking, please get into the passenger seat, please get into the passenger seat. But nope. He climbs right into the driver's side, starts the engine, then drives off. I'm not saying I have a photographic memory or anything, more like I was repeating his license plate number back to myself as I grabbed my phone and plugged it into the Notepad app. Then I called the cops, told them they had a drunk driver on their hands, then just let karma do its thing. There was nothing I could do about him taking one person's life and getting away with it. But I sure wasn't about to stand by and let him kill someone else as the result of being a reckless idiot. One of the worst days of my life came right out of nowhere. I was working in my job at a local 7-Eleven, just burning away the daylight hours with no passion in life, no purpose, no nothing. Then suddenly, I feel this terrible headache coming on. I take a few painkillers, then got back to what I was doing. Some customer comes in, I ring them up for a coffee and a pack of donuts, and then that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital, and the nurses were prepping me for surgery. I was told I'd been diagnosed with a bleed in my brain and that the surgery would involve drilling a hole in my skull to drain the fluid. Then, just as they were about to put me under, the head of neurology got in touch with someone and called off the surgery completely. What actually happened is that I'd suffered an aneurysm, and according to my doctor, who told me this much later on, I would have probably been dead on the table just seconds after the surgery commenced. With a brain bleed, the solution is to drill holes in your skull, which relieves pressure and prevents your brain from swelling up and squeezing against your skull. If it does that, it can lead to some pretty serious brain damage, which is obviously very bad news. But in the case of an aneurysm, which is what is actually going on, that kind of surgery can prevent sufficient blood flow to your brain due to the sharp drop in blood pressure in your brain tissue. This then basically starves your brain of oxygen, leading to acute tissue death, which obviously just straight up kills you. That head of neurology legitimately saved my life that day, and the whole thing dramatically changed my outlook on life. A person can still feel perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, and then one little weak blood vessel in your brain and boom, it can all be over for them. Life is a terrifyingly fragile thing, one that can really just end at any moment. I quit my job at the 7-Eleven when I was recovering in the hospital, then asked my dad and mom if they could put me up in my old bedroom while I trained to be a comic book artist. They thought my choice of career was a little outlandish, and I don't blame them, but I think the shock of almost losing me to some random medical thing made them reevaluate a few things too. These days, I work as a full-time comic book artist, and although I don't make a ton of money, I feel like I'm actually living the life I want to, the one I was supposed to live, not one that's being dictated to me by my need for money or prestige or acceptance. I suppose I'm telling you all this because I hope everyone on Earth can live that way too, and it honestly breaks my heart that some people don't have a choice in the matter, because the idea that someone's life could just end while they were working some terrible retail job or doing just about anything they didn't want to do, I don't just find it heartbreaking, I find the concept utterly terrifying. Probably because I was just one surgery away from that exact same thing happening to me. Born on January 13th of 1963, Peter Gerard Scully was born and raised in the Australian city of Melbourne. Little is known about his childhood, though it's believed that he was raised Catholic by two strict Scotch-Irish parents. After graduating university, Peter made a living as some kind of property developer and became exceptionally wealthy in the process. By the mid-2000s, Peter was living with his wife and 2 children in a large 4-bedroom house in suburban Melbourne. He had a life that almost anyone would be envious of, but one day, his entire world began to fall apart. In 2011, Peter and his partners were forced to declare bankruptcy after a development scheme of theirs appeared to completely fall through. Very little work had been done on the actual construction site, yet Peter and his company claimed that every penny of the $2.6 million investment fund was gone. Naturally, their investors weren't happy and initiated legal proceedings against Peter and his partners. Peter claimed that he could account for losses in the way that was perfectly legal, but in reality, he was already preparing to flee the country. For years, he'd been scamming investors out of their money in what amounted to a very well-disguised Ponzi scheme. By the time it emerged that Peter was indeed acting illegally, he had already fled Australia on a false passport before establishing an entirely new identity in the Philippines' capital of Manila. Once he'd established a degree of anonymity, and knowing that Manila was the first place Filipino police would look for him, Peter traveled over land and sea before reaching the southernmost island on Mindanao. It was here that Peter began setting up a new life for himself, and although he'd managed to flee Australia with a sizable amount of investors' cash, his expensive tastes meant that it would only be a matter of months before he was flat broke again. Peter needed a way of earning a living, yet he couldn't do so legally, as it'd almost certainly give away his location to the authorities. He obviously wasn't afraid of operating outside of legal constraints, but with his reputation in tatters, there was no way of him securing any reliable outside investment. Peter needed money. He needed a lot of it, and he needed it quickly. So he turned to the darkest and most depraved of all online marketplaces, the exploitation of children. With the help of 2 Filipino women named Karma Ann Alvarez and Lizo Margario Castaña, Peter began setting up one of the most evil and prolific child exploitation websites in contemporary history. He would send Alvarez and Castaña out into some of Mindanao's poorest towns and villages, promising generous financial compensation to the parents of any child willing to hand them over for the purposes of a photo shoot. The children were then returned a few days later, visibly shaken but with sizable wads of cash with them. The children either never spoke of the ordeals they'd faced at the hands of Peter and his so-called girlfriends, and those that did were either hushed up or disregarded. The harrowing abuse that took place at Peter's photo shoots were recorded before the videos were uploaded onto a dark web messaging forum that he created named No Limits Fun. The most notorious of these videos was entitled Daisy's Destruction, and depicts the despicable abuse of 3 underage Filipino girls. A mere preview was uploaded to the webpage, while Peter offered visitors the full unedited recording for around $10,000. One of the most active of the abusers in the tape is the 19-year-old Lizo Margario, who had herself been trafficked at a similar age as the children that she ended up abusing. For 5 long years, Peter and his accomplices continued to traffic and abuse children until one day, Karma Alvarez appeared to have had a change of heart. To Karma's knowledge, Peter's routine was simple. He'd trick a parent into giving him their child, record their exploitation, then return them with money. But even this had proved too burdensome on her conscience. She apparently pressured him to raise his age bracket, so to speak, and to introduce alcohol to the girls so they didn't suffer as much during the abuse. Peter seemed to have agreed to this, as in 2015, he coaxed 2 teenage girls back to his home with the promise of food and alcohol. The girls came willingly at first, but when it became evident that Peter planned to abuse them, and to document it no less, they attempted to escape. Peter and his photographer, the identity of whom remains unclear, apprehended the girls in the process of their escape, before brutally beating them and dragging them into the home's earthen cellar. There, each girl was forced to dig their own grave before Peter announced that they were to be buried alive. The girls begged and pleaded for their lives, swearing on all they held dear that they'd never breathed a word of what had occurred that evening. It was only then that Peter planned to let them go, confident that fear would forever seal their lips. But before that, he decided to hang on to them for a few more days, just to make sure that he'd made his point clear. It was during this period of captivity that the girls were discovered chained up in the basement by Karma Alvarez. Horrified at what Peter had done, she waited until Peter left the house and then freed the girls from their bindings and allowed them to escape. She then drove to the nearest police station and told the whole grim tale to a pair of dumbstruck police officers. To locate and infiltrate Peter's dark web exploitation ring, the Filipino police enlisted the help of the Dutch National Child Exploitation Team. The international barriers in this investigation disappeared very quickly, noted Dutch detective Farid El Hamoudi. Everyone wanted the same thing, getting the responsible people behind bars. The NCET's white hat hackers made short work of the website's digital defenses. It was a welcome breakthrough, but what they found was nothing short of traumatizing. Peter's website accounted for one of the largest collections of exploitative images police have ever found, with hundreds of thousands of images accounting for thousands upon thousands of potential victims. Peter's own contributions were merely the tip of the iceberg, but what police found most disturbing was the sheer demand for new content. The exact number of sales Peter made has never been made public, but the millions of dollars in cryptocurrency seized from his digital wallet gives us an idea of the sheer volume. When it came time to put Peter in handcuffs, an international dragnet ensured that he had no escape from the Philippines or its surrounding territories. Police eventually tracked Peter to Malaybalay City, where he was arrested on February 20th of 2015. His arrest and eventual conviction led to the apprehension of another Australian predator, 22-year-old Matthew Graham. Using the pseudonym Lux, Graham ran a number of what he referred to as hurtcore sites on the dark web. These websites specialized in the proliferation of particularly violent child exploitation videos, and at his trial, Graham disgusted those in attendance by claiming that he had acted in the name of freedom. At his own trial, Peter Scully faced a grand total of 75 criminal charges, with most of them pertaining to the trafficking and exploitation of children. He was tried along with two other men, a Brazilian named Hanno Caetano de Oliveira and a German man named Christian Rusch, who were said to have played an intimate role in the recording and dissemination of Peter's crimes. Sections of the video were shown to the jury, who later described how the girl had been hung upside down while the abuse took place. It should be noted that the footage was so graphic that several members of the jury sought psychological counseling in the aftermath of the trial, while prosecutors admitted to being traumatized at the trial's conclusion. "They were the most devastating thing I'd ever seen," said Ruby Malinog. "I cried when I was watching them. In fact, I feel like crying just now while talking about it. It was hard to believe what I was seeing, and hard to believe that somebody could do those things to children." One of the top figures in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime called the case the most horrific thing she'd ever had to deal with Peter's crimes being so severe that the Philippine government flirted with the idea of reintroducing the death penalty, which had previously been abolished less than 10 years prior. Northern Mindanao Chief Prosecutor Jamie Umpa was quoted as saying, "If I had my choice, it would be death for Scully. I want it to happen. We have to send a strong message to others that if they come to the Philippines and torture and abuse our children in this way, they will be investigated with the full force of law and executed." At one point during the trial, Peter Scully appeared to laugh and joke with his confidants, but when he was found guilty on 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of violating underage girls, he failed to see the funny side. The 6 counts were enough to secure a life sentence, but not all Peter's crimes had been accounted for. In November of 2022, Peter received a second conviction and was sentenced to an additional 129 years in prison, while his more repentant accomplice, Karma Alvarez, received life with the possibility of parole. Lazo Margallo Castaña was sentenced to 126 years in prison for being an active participant in the exploitation. Two other accomplices, Alexander Lau and Maria Dorothea Chia, who were said to have played a lesser role in the exploitation ring, were sentenced to 9 years apiece. Since his imprisonment, Peter has complained of the conditions in the prison he's being held at, claiming overcrowding and underfeeding has led to a rapid deterioration in his health. Jail warden Ferdinand Pontillo told the media that he wants to be pampered with luxury food and a mobile telephone so he can make international calls. He wants the same conditions as there are in Australian jails, but this is not Australia. Peter has refused to comment on the allegations, but it stands to reason that his lifelong home is severely overcrowded. Davao Prison and Penal Farm was built to house no more than 350 prisoners, but as of November 2022, it was home to almost 2,000 inmates. Yet it's difficult to feel any sympathy for a man who showed such a despicable lack of mercy or empathy for those whose lives he succeeded in destroying, all for his own perverse financial gain. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Peter's case is that jailing him barely made a dent in the ongoing effort to rid the world of child exploitation. There are many, many more monsters like Peter, who lurk in the darkest, most forbidden corners of the dark web, dedicated to spreading the most heinous and unforgivable filth known to man. The only silver lining of such a dark, foreboding cloud is that for every evil, dark web predator, there are a dozen equally dedicated law enforcement agents who want nothing more than to put them in handcuffs.
A couple of years ago, when I was in high school, I was hanging out with some of my friends, and they started talking about the deep web. My friend George had been on it before, and he was telling us things about it. We talked about the deep web for the whole lunch period at school, and I started to get really curious about it and wanted to give it a try sometime. Later that day, when I got home from school, my curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to try to access the deep web. I was texting with George, and he told me the browser to get and what to do. I followed his instructions, and I was able to get on. Then, I looked up some deep web websites to visit. The very first one that I went to was a screen that was all black with a small icon on the upper left corner. When I clicked on it, it took me to a web page filled with images with no context. Some of the images were animals, like fish or a bear. The others were a bunch of random objects. I clicked on the fish. Then the page started loading. It took a long time to load. I would say a good 30 seconds or so. Once it was finally done loading, I saw my face on the screen. It was coming from my webcam. I quickly scrambled to find a blanket from my bed and covered the webcam with it. The screen then went black. I was relieved to see, but then some text started to appear on the screen, getting typed out. The first thing said my name, but not just my first name, it was my full name, first, middle, and last. This really freaked me out. Then, to my horror, more of my personal information started to be typed out on the screen. It said the school I attended, then my phone number, and then the state and city that I lived in. I couldn't take it anymore, and I went to close out of it. But when I tried, I couldn't. My mouse was frozen. I tried pushing Control-Alt-Delete many times, and nothing happened. I began panicking and pressing random buttons on my keyboard. I went to turn off my monitor, but nothing happened still. Then I pushed the power button on my computer, and still nothing happened. Finally, I went to the wall and unplugged the power source, which was an extension cord plugged into the wall. Everything turned off at that point. I sat there in shock for several minutes before plugging my computer back in to delete the browser. Thankfully, I had been planning to get a new computer for a while, and I got one shortly after. I will never forget that experience with the deep web. I used to visit the deep web all the time. I have always been into computers, and my friends and I would occasionally visit the deep web out of curiosity when we were younger. One day, I was by myself in a deep web chat room. The chat rooms on the deep web always seemed to entertain me. On this day, I was mostly just watching people talk, but I occasionally would chime in. Then, one of the users in the chat mentioned me. We were having a conversation, but then it turned into a bit of an argument. The other user said something along the lines of that he was going to get me. I assumed he was joking, and I responded with a wisecrack. That made him angry, and he said some more bad things to me. At that point, I was getting kind of uncomfortable, so I decided to leave, and I closed out of everything and logged off. About 10 minutes later, I received a text on my phone. It was from an unknown number, and it said, "Why did you leave?" This was pretty creepy, but I knew that there were a lot of skilled hackers that went on the deep web, so I wasn't all that amazed. I decided to ignore the text and hope that he wouldn't contact me again. I figured it was just some guy trying to scare me, and while I have to admit I was a little bit scared, I tried not to let it eat at my brain. A couple of hours later, my phone started ringing. It was an unknown number. I picked it up and answered. There was no voice on the other end, but just breathing. I hung up on them and went back to what I was doing. But a few minutes later, I happened to glance out my front window and noticed there was a car parked in front of my house. I looked to try to see who it was, but from the angle it was parked, and also it being dark outside, I couldn't see. I kept my eye on it over the next few hours. It didn't move at all. Eventually, I tried to get some sleep. I covered all the windows in my house and double-checked all the locks before I went to bed. It took me a long time, but eventually I was able to fall asleep. The next day, I woke up and went to the window to check and see if the car was still there. It was finally gone, and I was relieved. When I went to go on my computer, I turned it on to see that there was already several files open. They were photos. There were a few of my house and my car, and then I saw one of inside my house. Then I saw the worst one of all, which was a photo of me sleeping taken from inside my house. It looked like it had been taken from my bedroom doorway. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I ran around my house checking every room, but nobody was in there anymore. I went to my front door and saw that it was unlocked. I have no idea how they were able to get in my house. I am a really deep sleeper, and I guess that was why they didn't wake me up. For the next few days, I was looking over my shoulder every 5 seconds and kept looking out the window to see if the car would return. Everything was fine until about a week later, when I woke up in the middle of the night hearing a noise coming from my room. At first I thought I was just imagining things, but then I sat up just in time to see the back of a man walking past my room. This time, I called the police immediately. As I did, I heard the person leaving my house. I had no interest in going after them. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, and I explained the whole thing to them. I know I should have called the police after the first time, but I just felt stupid because it was my own fault for going on the deep web. The police took down the information and said they would patrol the neighborhood over the next few nights. Nothing more happened since, and I won't go on the deep web anymore. This story took place a long time ago, sometime in the mid-2000s. I was in high school at the time, and my favorite thing to do after school was play on my computer. I know, I wasn't one of the big popular jocks, but I was a really shy kid, and gaming was always fun for me. I had heard about the deep web, and one day I decided to go on it for the first time. I was pretty good with technology, so I was able to figure out how to get on pretty easily. I visited a couple of websites that were pretty normal, and the more time I spent, the more I was able to find the unusual websites. They were some of the craziest websites I had ever seen. I remember I came across a website that seemed to be filled with puzzles and codes of some sort. I looked at them for about 10 to 15 minutes, and it was pretty interesting to try to understand them. But suddenly, out of nowhere, my fax machine started printing something. When it came out, it was a paper with a large series of numbers on it. I didn't know how this was able to happen. Then it printed another and another. I started to get creeped out, and I took all the rest of the paper out of my printer so that it would stop. My printer kept trying to print things. Then my phone started ringing. It was an old landline, of course, and we didn't have caller ID, so I answered it to see who it was. But all I heard on the other end was a series of beeps and similar noises. I hung up the phone and decided I needed to log off of the deep web. I closed out of the website and turned my computer off. I was pretty shook up from what had happened. Then the phone rang again, and I once again answered because my parents were still gone at work, and I didn't know if it would be them calling. But once again I just heard the noises that I had heard before. I hung up again. The printer was still making noises as well. I ended up unplugging the printer from the wall, and I started to ignore the phone calls that kept coming in. Finally, I decided to unplug the phone from the wall as well. My parents came home from work a little while later, so I plugged the printer and phone back in. I was really hoping that the phone calls and the faxes would not continue. Thankfully, they didn't, and everything went back to normal. However, about 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail addressed to me with no return address. When I went inside and opened it up, I saw that it was a paper with more numbers of code. I got extremely freaked out, but thankfully, nothing else happened, and I never got any more faxes, phone calls, or letters. I don't know who or what was behind the letter and the phone calls, but I'm hoping it was just a skilled hacker having some fun.
Let me set the scene. The year is 1998, and the Euro is created. I was of the age of 14, sitting on my parents' desktop PC, using god-awful dial-up internet to research the history of William the Conqueror's harrying of the North, when my friend, who for the purposes of this story shall be called Jake, messaged me on IRC. "Hey, some dude at school told me something really cool you can do on your PC." "What?" I asked. 1. Open up Start. 2. Go to Run. 3. Enter 2ndrely2.frt. 4. Tell me when you're done. I did what he told me. What opened up looked like some type of command prompt. It had 2 boxes that text should be entered into, and a regular command line. "Done," I informed him. In the box, write your name. In the second, write a password. And in the other bit, write rtileoh.us. I did exactly what I was told, and a box telling me to enter a nickname popped up. I wrote Tom Elton. The window closed. A few moments later, a batch file opened that said, "Welcome to the Artile, Ohio chat room. User Tom Elton has joined." I spent the next few months talking to my friends on that chat room. I had no idea who created it or hosted it. It seemed to only work in the Artile, Ohio area, meaning I could talk to anyone there in theory. The only people who were there was me, Jake, and a couple of other people I was friends with. Someone from the preparatory school across town, and once, Somebody who claimed to work for the insurance company's tech support, who left after the only response he got was, "What school you at?" I don't know why we use this instead of a normal chat room. Maybe the whole secret gathering aspect of it made us more drawn to it. I don't know for sure. I woke up one fall morning and checked the chat room and found out that I had been promoted to an administrator. I had no idea who did it, but I got to brag to my friends for the next few days and change what people were typing to make them look dumb. But other than that, my powers went unused, until one day, I logged on to see that the anonymous messages to admins was not empty for a change. I wish I didn't check to see what was there. It was a full story from a user called 09HDI7RF, written in multiple single-sentence messages. They described how they were being physically abused by their parents, how they weren't allowed to go outside the house, and how she snuck into her dad's computer and saw this chat room open, and decided to tell anybody she could. I responded with, "Who is this? Also, if this was real, you would have called the cops." Later that day, the chat room stopped working. I couldn't get it to work at all. I got an error message every time I searched the command on my PC's run feature. I was royally pissed off with the fact that me and my friend's secret hidey hole was now dead. 2 days later, what do I see in the news? Girl shot dead by her father after breaking out of her home through a window. The mother was in police custody, but the father was never caught. The family's PC contains documents describing kids named Jake, Tom, and others, describing what he imagined their appearance to be, and what he would do to them if he ever found them, which was too horrific to describe here. That man was never caught, to my knowledge. He is still on the run today, hiding amongst everyone. I'm certain that he will never be caught.
Let the story I'm about to tell you be a lesson for you. Choose your friends carefully, because sometimes the people you think are your friends are the very monsters we're afraid of. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but honestly it's true. This is an absolutely crazy story, and I'm still in awe of how certain individuals can act. A little more than a year ago, I moved to a new town. I'm a city girl, but was happy to start a new life in this town. I don't want to say that this is a country town, but it's a fraction of the size of the place where I grew up. I spent the first few months just keeping to myself and learning the day-to-day operation and how it works at my new job. On weekends, I would just sort of listen and see what everyone was up to. A couple of weeks into the job, I finally got invited out by one of the girls I worked with. I'll be honest, this was a lot like high school. This was the girl that I wanted to hang out with. She was the popular girl at our job, and all the guys liked her, and the girls wanted to hang out with her. Yes, we were adults, and this mindset still applies. We went to some local bar that Friday night after work. I wasn't drinking much since I didn't want to make a fool of myself with my potential new friends. It didn't take long for me to realize exactly the kind of person she was. For the purpose of the story, I'll refer to her as Marissa. She was getting that wild level of intoxicated, and it was uncomfortable. I laughed along and just hoped the night would end soon. I made sure all the girls got an Uber home, and I finally headed off myself at around 2 in the morning. I was exhausted that night and clearly underestimated these girls. When I woke up in the morning, I had forgotten about a lot of the nonsense from the night before and just remembered the good times. I was happy to have friends and not be alone, and that thought alone blinded me from the reality of who Marissa really was. The next night, we all hung out again, and the night was a copy of the previous nights. Nothing noteworthy other than Marissa being out of control again. That week at work, all week long, Marissa was constantly saying how she couldn't wait to get out again this weekend and that she loved hanging out with me. I was actually flattered and was ready to do it again this upcoming Friday. Friday came, and this time she was beyond intoxicated. She had become mean, even to her friends and the other girls we work with. They all left and, in so many words, basically said, "Forget this chick." I was paraphrasing there since I don't want to write what the girls actually said, and before I knew it, it was just me and Marissa at the bar, and she was barely coherent. I got her home and stayed on her couch to make sure that she was all right. When I woke up in the morning, she was already awake and cleaning her kitchen. She thanked me for the previous night and invited me to a party later in the evening. I knew I didn't have plans, so I of course accepted the invitation. She told me to pick her up at around 10 that night and that she would direct me to the party. She had me excited about the party before we even left the house, and she told me it was going to be an epic party at her friend's barn. Massive bonfire, some food, drinks, dancing, and much better company than we would have at a local bar. I was so excited that I was basically singing in the car. Well, that excitement started to dwindle when I realized how long we'd be driving. It was after 11 and we still weren't there. If I knew I was going to have to drive an hour to some party, I would have declined, but Marissa was pumped and I really wanted her to like me. She finally had me pull over, and sketchy is the only word I can think of to describe this situation. There was nothing in sight at all. No streetlights, no signs, no houses, and most notably, no party. I asked her what was going on, and she says, "You're gonna love this." It was so dark when we pulled up, I didn't even realize that there was a small barn on the side of the road. I could see the beam from a small flashlight shining through the doors. Marissa told me that the party was over there and we needed to hurry up, which made no sense. Why would we need to hurry up? While we were briskly walking over towards this barn, I noticed that Marissa was wearing jeans and the person who was waving the flashlight seemed to be dressed in all black. Yet here I am, wearing some cute dress, and I got full makeup on. When I was almost at the barn door, I noticed that Marissa seemed to have fallen back. She was walking about a foot behind me for some reason. The guy with the light opened the door, and inside, I still can't believe what I saw. It was one of Marissa's friends from the bar, the one that said not so nice things to her. She was sitting unconscious in a chair. I immediately freaked out and demanded to know what was going on, and Marissa replies, "She disrespected me, and now she's paying for it." I was stunned by the completely unhinged nature of her. I knew at this point that she was a wild party girl, but I didn't think that she was capable of whatever this was. I didn't want to know why I was there, and I didn't give her the option to tell me. Thinking as quickly as I could, I just kicked some dirt in the guy's face who was holding the light, and I just grabbed the unconscious girl. I wasn't worried about Marissa stopping me because I was nearly double her size. I hoisted her up, running to my car, and basically threw the girl in my back seat and sped off. While I was driving, I was fortunate enough to get some service, and even though, like I said, there was nothing anywhere close to us, I was able to call the police and told them that I had an unconscious woman in my back seat. I told them about Marissa and that she was with a guy. Thankfully, not long into the drive, the girl started to move and groan, and then she started to talk. I pulled over and explained what had happened, and she started crying. She said that the guy was some guy that she had been seeing for a little bit, and he was taking her to a party at a barn. When she got there, Marissa was there and hit her with some sort of heavy object across the face, and whatever it was knocked her out for a while. We finally linked up with the cops, and Marissa's former friend was taken to the hospital and treated for a minor concussion, and thankfully that was all. Later that evening, they found Marissa at her house, and she was completely surprised as to why she was getting arrested. She claimed to have had done nothing wrong, and the events that just transpired were just a prank. They never did catch the guy, and since he had been using a fake name and a fake cell phone number, and Marissa refused to turn him in. From what I understand, she still claims that this was just some sort of prank, and now she's locked up under false pretenses, under her word. I can't remember exactly what they did charge her with, but I know she got in trouble for assaulting her with a weapon and kidnapping, so obviously her future doesn't look too bright. This is truly insane to be a part of, and I hope at least one person can learn from my mistakes. This is a short story that happened to me several years ago when I was a junior in high school. All of my friends got to travel to Myrtle Beach with the baseball team for spring break, but since I didn't play baseball, I was stuck at home. My one friend, Dave, was home too since we were the skaters of the friend group. We spent most nights of the break hanging out together and not doing really much, except for one night when we stayed at Dave's house. He literally lives in the middle of the woods, The closest neighborhood isn't that far away, but because of where his house is located, it truly feels like the middle of nowhere. Toward the end of the break, we snuck out of the house to see a girl who lived near him. Since she and a few other girls from school were still in town, we figured that we would hang out with them. And like I said, it wasn't far, just sort of an unnerving walk because there aren't very many lights and most of the walk is in the seclusion of trees and rocks. We had an awesome time hanging out with them. I liked this girl at the time, so it was great to be able to spend so much time with her. When we were walking back to the house that night, Dave noticed some random guy following us, but I didn't think anything of it. He was freaked out, and I told him to relax. The guy was following us closely, but not close enough for us to actually panic. When we made it back to his house, I watched the guy continuing walking up the street, and he never seemed to look back. I just looked at my buddy and told him that he was freaking out for no reason. The next night, we hung out again, and his parents were going out of town for the weekend, so he was going to have the house to himself. Since he was embarrassed by his house, he didn't want to have anyone over. Trust me when I say, I pushed hard for the girls to stay over, but I lost the argument. I told the girls that we couldn't hang out there, so instead, Dave and I walked to her house again. This time, we spent a considerable amount of time there. We didn't walk home until after about 3 a.m. Dave was relieved on the way home that we didn't have anybody following us this time. I helped him close up the house, and we got comfortable in the living room before passing out on the couches. At this point in the night, I was having one of the best nights of my life. I actually kissed the girl that I liked, and I legitimately felt invincible. Not long after lying down, we heard a knock on the door, and we both froze. "What the hell was that?" Dave exclaimed. Then the knock came again. It was a low and rhythmic knocking. Each bang on the wood made my hair stand up, and I slowly got up and, standing a few feet from the door, I shouted, "Who is it?" There was no response right away. And then a young female voice shouted from the other side, "Hey, I was wondering, can I please hide inside?" I didn't say anything right away. The absurd nature of the statement and the calm tone of her voice left me speechless. Before I said anything, she spoke again. "It's going to be too late if you don't let me in. Can I please hide inside your house?" When I said that I was speechless, I mean I was absolutely at a loss for words. I had a million things flying through my head, and I just didn't know what to do. My instincts told me that it was the girls playing a joke on us, but I didn't recognize that voice. I decided not to answer, and neither did Dave, and we just sat in silence. And then I noticed the doorknob starting to jiggle back and forth, first slowly, and then more aggressively. And then, the calm voice instantly became more sinister when she said, "Open the damn door now!" I finally was able to shout, "Go away! I'm going to call the police!" There were no sounds for a few seconds. This woman spoke again. She started in a soft tone, and in the middle of the sentence, I could hear this sinister tone coming out, and she says, "Hun, if you don't open the door right now, I'm going to lose my mind." Dave finally jumped up from the couch and shouted for her to go away. And then a second voice could be heard from behind the door. It was a deep voice from a man, and he said, "Good call, bud. Very, very good call." Right after he said that, I thought I could hear what sounded like footsteps walking away. So I looked out of the window and saw 2 people walking down the street. One of them looked suspiciously like the person from the previous night. It just seemed very similar in stature. We were terrified and stayed awake for the rest of the night. Since his parents weren't home, we didn't call the police, even though obviously we should have. Dave was scared that his parents would get mad if the police showed up and they weren't home. On Sunday morning, when his parents came home, Dave told them what had happened, and they instantly called the police, calling us stupid, which we were. Better late than never, I guess. And since several hours had passed since the woman had been at the door, The police were honest with Dave's parents and told them that they would probably never catch these two people, but that they would be on the lookout for similar incidents. I have no idea what those two wanted or who they even were. I don't even like being outside at night anymore. That night really messed me up for a long time, and I'm still trying to recover from the mental nightmare I endured.
I'm a 20-year-old male. I live in a small, quiet town in the state of Ohio. One day I decided that I wanted to go camping in the woods because I'm an outdoors type of person, and I could really use the fresh air. My girlfriend Tiffany wasn't too thrilled at the idea, so I went alone. Fast forward to a day later, and I'd made it to the woods and found a really nice clearing in the shape of a circle that was surrounded by trees. It seemed like the perfect place to set up my camp. As I was setting up my tent, I thought that I heard footsteps off in the distance. I shrugged my shoulders, thinking it was just another camper nearby, and I went back to setting up my tent. There's a lake not too far from where my camp was, so I went over to the lake with my fishing pole, and I started fishing. After I was done, I began walking back to my camp. And that's when I noticed something that I didn't notice before. There was a poster of a missing girl. She had blonde curly hair, blue eyes, and she had a huge smile on her face. The poster read, "Have you seen this girl?" After reading the poster, I had an uneasy feeling in my stomach. I put my hand on my stomach and began walking back to my camp. A few hours later, the sun began to set, and I'd started making my campfire now. While making the fire, I'd started thinking about the poster of the missing girl that I saw earlier. I could only imagine how her family's feeling right now, I said to myself. It was officially nighttime at this point, and I sat in front of the fire roasting marshmallows and hot dogs like a typical camper. As I finished up eating my food, I decided it was time to go to sleep, so I put out the fire, entered my tent, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I would say a few hours went by when I suddenly woke up from hearing footsteps nearby. I wonder who that is, I thought to myself. I pretended like I was still asleep as the footsteps walked past the tent. But then I heard another sound. It was the sound of something brushing up against the tent. I opened my eyes and I turned my head to where I thought the sound was coming from. Well, I then saw the most terrifying thing that I'd ever seen. It was a silhouette of a man holding an object with a long handle. I quietly moved my head closer and I looked at the object's handle. I wanted to find out what he was holding. It was an axe. I began to quiver in fear as I'd seen the silhouette outside walking around my tent. What was going to happen to me? I thought to myself. After a few minutes of circling the tent, the silhouette finally walked away. I waited for what seemed like an eternity before I could gather all the courage to get out of that tent and run. I carefully zipped open the tent and I began to make a break for it. I ran for about 5 minutes straight. I then heard a growl from behind me. I turned around slowly and my eyes widened. Standing 20 feet away from me was a very deranged looking man. He was wearing all black, including a black leather jacket, biker boots, and shiny silver buckles. The most disturbing part was that he had cuts all over his face. He then gave me a stomach-turning smile, showing off his set of nasty yellow teeth, and he began walking toward me with his axe. That's when I turned back around and took off, all the while I can hear the man chasing after me. I ran for about 10 minutes until I finally saw my car parked out in the distance. I ran straight to my car, unlocked my car door, got inside, and then turned on the car and drove off. As I was driving, I was looking in the rearview mirror, and I'd seen the man once again. He was just standing in the middle of the road smiling directly at me. I'm now back home with my girlfriend, and I've never told her about the encounter, but as I'm writing this, I can still hear those sounds of the growls and laughter right outside my window. I can't get it out of my head. I know that it's all just in my head, but I just can't forget it. That was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. This is gonna be a long one, so I apologize in advance, but the background details are necessary for this story. I'm a 20-year-old female. I was recently in Africa on vacation with my family, and we had stayed 2 nights at a desert camp in the Sahara. The first night, my sister and I were talking and hanging out with these guys who worked there, who were probably all around the ages of 20 to 35. It seems like they were just very friendly and harmless. I noticed at the campfire that night that one of the guys started paying more attention to me specifically, and I felt a little uncomfortable, but I figured it was just a language barrier or something. So out in the desert, you can see the stars really well, and even the Milky Way on clear nights, but you have to wait for the moon to go down, which is around 2 a.m. I guess it's a normal thing for the guys to come around to the tents, which are luxury tents by the way. They're furnished with beds, lights, a toilet and shower, as well as a lock on the doors. So not your typical camping. They knock on the door to see if you're awake and if you want to come out to look at the stars. My sister and I were sharing a tent, my parents in a separate one across the walkway. The first night around midnight, I had told my sister that I was way too tired to go out because I was falling asleep. So she left to look at the stars without me. And I didn't lock the door because I didn't want her to get locked out if I fell asleep. Well, fast forward about an hour, and I'm on my side asleep, when I suddenly wake up to then see a head peeking in from the tent door. I thought it was my sister, so I then groggily asked her, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because it was just really weird the way she was standing there. I start to wake up more, and I realize it's this guy from the campfire's head, and he's peeking in my room while I'm asleep. Now, it could have just been a simple misunderstanding, but I felt totally violated with my privacy, especially because, we're on their territory in the middle of the desert. Like, I'm not kidding, we had to take a 30-minute truck ride into the dunes. I was in a fight or flight at that moment. He literally woke me up with a panic attack, and I started totally freaking out. So I went to the door and I told him I was tired. He kept trying to get me to come out to the dunes with a blanket. Classic male move. But I just kept saying that I didn't feel good and I was really tired, which was true. At this moment, I didn't know where my sister was. I don't know where my family is. And all I know is this man standing in front of me, literally just watching me sleep. I also don't know how long he was there for. It could have been a literal second, or it could have been 2 minutes. But either way, I was high-key horrified by this. I told him no yet again, and that I'd look at the stars tomorrow. He told me he wouldn't be at the camp the next night, and that's why he wanted to go out tonight, but I wouldn't budge. Once he finally realized that I wasn't going to come outside, he asked me if he could have my number, and I told him no, I have a boyfriend. I don't, but it seemed the only way this man would respect my disinterest by knowing I was with another man. Well, after I said that, he asked me for my first name. I ended up giving it to him because I didn't really think it would do much harm. I then said goodnight, and I locked the door this time. I then went to the bathroom, and I had really bad diarrhea. This isn't really important to the story. I just wanted to show that he scared the literal shit out of me. And while I was on the toilet, I heard him come back and start calling my name from outside the tent. But I just stayed quiet and didn't say anything. I finished in the bathroom and went back to bed, still trying to calm down from what had just happened because my heart was racing, and I still heard him calling my name. I laid in bed as still as I could, and I didn't say anything. I tried texting my dad, but he wasn't answering, and I didn't really feel comfortable leaving the tent. Finally, my sister came back, and my dad was with her. So I told them what just happened, and they were really confused. They thought it was weird, but the conversation didn't really go much further than that. The next day, I had brought it up at breakfast yet again, and my sister and dad basically told me that I was just being dramatic about it, and that I should really just stop talking about it already, because it wasn't that big of a deal. Literally, my mom was the only one who agreed that it wasn't okay at all. So it's now the second night, and my sister and I were both out under the stars talking to the guys and relaxing. Keep in mind though, it's very dark, and you can't see any of the faces. So I was having a normal conversation with this one guy. I couldn't see him that well, and all was going well. After a while, he asked if I remember him, and I'm like, well, no, I can't really see you. So he tells me to shine a light on him, and so I do. And wouldn't you know, it's the same from my tent. I especially wasn't expecting him to be the dude right in front of me, because he told me he wouldn't be there that night. Which leads me to believe that he had picked up a shift just to see me. But I can't be too sure about that. Who really knows why he was there? But surprisingly, he was fine that night, and he actually respected my boundaries this time. So I decided not to say anything to the other guys who ran the camp. I was honestly planning on doing so if he did anything remotely uncomfortable, but he didn't. So the next morning we left the area, and a few days later, I actually started getting message requests on Instagram. This found me. I had accidentally tagged the whole desert. So you're telling me he found me based on my name and location, not even a specific location, an entire desert, and my name isn't even unique either. Anyway, he starts messaging me, and although I'm creeped out, I'm also thinking, well, he's harmless. I might as well see what he says. He says, and I quote, "You know, I'm really so happy to find your account. I was really looking for you, trying to find you for a long time." Which I found highly creepy to even say to someone. But again, it could have just been a cultural difference, but who knows? I didn't answer, and he messaged me again a few days later, asking me how I was. But yeah, I didn't answer. I'm really curious to know what everyone else thinks about this, and if I really was overreacting, or if you think my gut feeling was actually right. I mean, he seemed to be actually harmless in the end, but you never know.
To all those out there who live in areas near wide stretches of empty land like I do, I'm sure you've already been warned why it's dangerous to travel on back roads at night. Growing up in Seattle, one of the biggest cities on the West Coast, I never really needed to worry about the dangers of driving in the middle of nowhere, until I committed to a college in eastern Washington. For those of you who have never been there, the eastern side of Washington is very different from the western side. Some may even think that they accidentally took a wrong turn into a different state. Primarily used as farmland, eastern Washington is almost completely absent from all the elements that give the other side its famous reputation. Instead, this side is mostly just rolling fields of wheat and dried grass that stretch into the distance with a few tumbleweeds and windmills here and there. Driving through this area while the sun is still out is actually quite pleasant on a nice day. The big sky above and nothing but miles and miles of golden hills on each side of you. Driving through eastern Washington at night was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I ever had, and here's why. If you've ever had to drive down a dark country road at night, I'm sure that you've already been lectured by everybody and their mothers on the obvious dangers like drunk drivers, falling asleep at the wheel, and animals suddenly running across the road. In my particular area, we have a lot of issues with head-on collisions, mainly in part of antsy students passing cars recklessly in an effort to get home faster. In addition to these more sensible hazards to be aware of, there's also a lot of superstitions like ghosts and murdering hitchhikers that wait on the side of the road at odd hours of the night, begging for a ride. To top it all off, probably the most dangerous part of driving on these back roads at night is the fact that there is no cell service throughout a massive part of the area. So basically, if anything happens to you out here, you're screwed, because you'll have no way of contacting anyone for help. There is no civilization around for who knows how many miles, and the chances of another car coming by anytime soon is pretty slim. With these dangers in mind, it's safe to say that the story I have for you is about an occurrence that I hope never needs to be warned of again. Now let me begin by saying that the creepiest thing about driving through these empty farmlands at night is by far the lack of light. There is no need for any street lights in the middle of nowhere, and no towns or cities anywhere nearby. The only light besides your own headlights is that of the stars and moon above. It's a surreal experience looking out your window and seeing only the darkness beyond the railing on the side of the road. Mostly because you have no idea what could be out there. And that's why you should be scared of driving on country roads at night. One night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from my cabin in eastern Washington when I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. When we passed the car, I noticed that it was completely empty and wondered where the people inside could have gone, considering there was nothing even remotely in walking distance from where we were. I figured that they had run out of gas and had to hitch a ride to the nearest town. My theory of where they had gone prompted my boyfriend to tell me a story that I will never forget. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Washington State had a bit of a cult problem. This wasn't the first time I was hearing of this, considering the fact that one of the church camps I went to when I was younger was oddly enough built on the grounds of a disbanded satanic cult. Who made that decision? Anyways, most of these cults resided over in the east side because of how far it was away from everything and everybody, and they wanted to isolate themselves. These cults could basically do whatever they wanted and fly completely under the radar due to the fact that there was nobody around to stop them, because a lot of the time nobody even knew they were out there. And that's why they were able to get away with what they did. My boyfriend told me that one summer morning, a police station in one of the very few tiny towns amongst the farmlands received a call reporting a missing person. The caller claimed that her husband had not returned from his shift at the paper mill the night before, and she was worried that he had gotten into an accident because he hadn't answered any of her calls. Many of the residents in these small towns commuted to jobs way out in the country lands, because many of them were either farmers or workers at the local paper mill, so accidents at night were not uncommon. The station agreed to send out a patrol car to look for him. At one point along the road, the officer noticed that one of the speed limit signs had disappeared and noted that it may have been the cause of the missing person's presumed accident. Local kids must have been bored, but what else did they have to do out there? The man's car was found pulled off to the side of the road, about halfway through his commute, without a single scratch on it. The man was nowhere to be found, but his car was unlocked, and his wallet and cell phone lie in plain view on the passenger seat. Something definitely did not seem right. After weeks of investigation, the man was still missing, and nobody had any idea where he had gone. For several days, the police station anxiously waited for any news that could solve the mystery behind the disappearance. But because of the usually uneventful nature of the area, the only report called in was that of another missing speed limit sign. A few days later, another call came in. There was another missing person report, almost identical to the one before. Somebody hadn't returned home from their shift the night before. The police sent out a patrol car once again, and sure enough, there it was. An untouched abandoned car on the side of the road, with the missing person's belongings clearly left behind. But there was something different this time. Faint scratch marks could be seen on the driver's seat that trailed onto the floor and out the door. It appeared that somebody had been dragged from their car. This realization of a possible assault or abduction raised great alarm, and an announcement was made to all local residents to lock their doors on their drives back home at night and be extremely cautious of anybody who may try and approach their car. One night around 2 a.m., the station received a call that would answer their disturbing question of where these people had disappeared to. A couple had been traveling on the road where the people had gone missing and had just narrowly escaped the fate of those before them. They had fortunately heard the announcement a week before and made sure their doors were locked and kept an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. Apparently, a few minutes after they had entered an area void of any cell service, they noticed a single ray of light that appeared to be floating directly in the middle of the road, just a ways down the route. Confused as to what it might be, the couple slowed down cautiously. As they neared the source of light, they saw something that gives them nightmares to this day. Standing in the middle of the road was a chain of people linked together arm in arm, creating a barrier on the street. There was a man in the middle that held a flashlight in his teeth. The car came to a complete stop. There was no way to go forward. Then, what seemed to be a split second after they had stopped their car, out of the complete and utter darkness on each side of the road, two people leapt over the railing and ran towards the car and tried to rip the doors open. The human chain had only been a distraction. Thankfully, their doors were locked, and the husband frantically switched their car into reverse and slammed the gas pedal. They had gotten away and immediately called the station once they regained service. When the police asked if they had seen where they had gone as they drove away, they simply answered with, "Back into the darkness beyond the road." An investigation occurred, but the people in the road were never found. To this day, nobody knows who those people were or where they came from. They eventually did find the bodies of the missing people. Both victims were found bound to what appeared to be a stolen speed limit sign. Their bodies were severely burned. What could be the reasoning behind ripping people from their cars at odd hours of the night and burning them alive out in the middle of nowhere? Without any explanation, the police chalked it up to cult activity. But how could it be possible that there was no trace of these people anywhere? It was almost as if they had vanished into thin air. What's more disturbing is the fact that they could still be out there. All I can tell you is to think twice next time you're driving down a dark country road at night and mindlessly staring into that deep darkness just beyond the railing. You never know who could be staring back.
This happened several years ago when I moved into a new apartment. I should mention that I'm female, and the place was older and on the edge of the city. During that time, it was all I could afford. The apartment itself was a small one-bedroom place on the 5th floor of a pretty tall building. I moved in with all of my stuff, which was only a few boxes, and started to unpack. For the most part, I liked the apartment because the location was pretty good, and it was enough space for me. My hallway had probably 15 or 20 other units on it. I made maybe 3 or 4 trips back and forth from my car to my apartment, bringing everything in. As I was doing this, and on the last trip I made, I saw a man leaving his room a little ways down the hallway. He was the first neighbor that I had seen. I finished bringing things in and then started unpacking. It took me basically the rest of the day to do so, and by nighttime I was all done. I didn't have to work for the next couple of days, so I got some food and stayed up late relaxing and enjoying my new place. I was up and watching TV when I heard a knock on my door. This was strange. It was almost midnight. I got up and walked over to the door, and I looked out the peephole. It was the guy who I had seen in the hallway earlier, one of my neighbors. It seemed a little bit strange to come to my door at this hour, but I decided to answer it. The guy was pretty tall, probably like 6'5". He had glasses and hair almost to his shoulders. When I opened up the door, he said hi to me. Then, he shook my hand and introduced himself. He told me that his name was Andrew, and he lived down the hallway. The guy seemed kind of awkward. The whole situation was kind of strange, but I thought that it was nice the fact that he came over to introduce himself to me. After I introduced myself back to him, we both stood there awkwardly for a few moments. Then, Andrew asked if I wanted to come over and have some coffee at his place. I told him no and said that it was late and I was going to bed. He asked if I was sure, and when I said yes, he said okay, and then I closed the door. Then I went back to what I was doing. I wasn't really that tired, but I didn't want to go to his place. I found it a little bit weird that he chose to come over and introduce himself to me so late at night. I stayed up for a while longer and then went to bed. The next day, I went out to get some groceries in the morning and was home for the rest of the day. I organized more of my things and did whatever for the rest of the day, but at night, once again, there was a knock at my front door. I got up and went to go see who it was. It was Andrew again. I opened the door to see what he wanted this time. Andrew said hi to me and then told me that he thought my mail got delivered to his place on accident. He said there was a package for me. I was a little bit confused, but curious what accidentally was delivered to him. He told me that he had it in his place, and he said we could go get it now. I said sure, and I walked out of my place and into the hallway. Then I followed Andrew down to his apartment. It was a few down from me and not that far at all. When we got to his place, he opened up the door and told me to go ahead inside. His place was somewhat dirty. He had a living room in the main area and then a bedroom off it, kind of like mine. As we walked inside, Andrew said that he kept the package in his bedroom for safekeeping. I followed him inside to the bedroom. When I got inside that room, there was far less furniture. Almost as soon as I walked in, though, Andrew suddenly moved behind me. The door then swung shut and slammed. My immediate reaction was to run over to the door and try to get out. But as I made it there, I heard a click, and when I tried opening it, the door was locked. I realized how stupid I had been. This guy already had come across as a little bit of a creep to me. How could I walk alone into his apartment late at night? I thought about how crazy his story sounded anyways. Why would he accidentally get one of my packages? I asked him what he was doing, but he didn't answer. I had my cell phone with me, and I pulled it out, but there was no signal in there. Nothing would go through. I'm not sure where Andrew went, but I didn't hear him from the other side. I looked around the bedroom. There was hardly anything in there. A mattress in the corner, a rug, and a nightstand. It was a terrifying place to be. His window had a cover on it. I pulled the cover off to see if I could see anybody outside, but the window seemed to be painted black from the inside. I couldn't see out of it, and I couldn't open it either. I was desperate. I yelled and asked to be let out, but nobody answered me. I walked all around the room, wondering what I could do. There didn't seem to be anything, though. As time went by, I realized that I needed to think of something to get out of there. I kept trying my phone, and I went to all parts of the room, but I just couldn't get any signal. Finally, I went over to one of the walls. This was a wall that bordered the apartment next door. I started knocking on it, wondering if the people on the other side would hear, or if they were even home or awake. But after several minutes of that with no luck, I turned it up a notch. I started pounding on the wall as hard as I could. It started to damage it a little bit. I then took my elbow and rammed it into the wall. Some of the wall ended up breaking, and I started yelling as loud as I could and banging on the wall. After a minute or so of this, the door to the room that I was in opened. Andrew stood there inside the doorway. He yelled at me to stop, then he started approaching. I grabbed the small nightstand because it was the only thing in the room that I could grab. I held it up to defend myself. This didn't stop Andrew at all. He kept going towards me. I shoved the nightstand at him, which pushed him back a little bit, and this was just enough for me to be able to run past him and out of the room. I ran for the door, which I was barely able to get to before he grabbed me. I had the door open, but Andrew was struggling to keep me inside. I heard somebody walking down the hallway, though, into our direction, and I started screaming as loud as I could. When the person got closer, Andrew pushed me away, then he himself took off running out of the apartment and down the hallway. The person in the hallway told me that they lived next door and they were wondering what on earth was going on. I explained to her the situation as I ran back for my apartment. The police were called, and Andrew was long gone by the time they got there. However, they were able to locate him not too long after that. I'm really lucky to have gotten away, and I'm especially grateful that the neighbor decided to come over and see what was going on.
I'm a female who's currently 30 years old, and this took place late last year in early November. My fiancé and I had just bought a boating company in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. At the time, we lived in LA, and because we had bought the company, we had to move to Florida to maintain it. Life was kind of what you'd expect for Florida. It rained a lot and was almost tropical during the summer months. If you've been to Florida or lived there, you'll probably relate to what I'm saying. Anyway, we had moved into a large one-storied home appropriate for a family of 4. We didn't have kids, but the house wasn't too expensive and we needed to find a new place. For the first month or so, the move had been well and we started to adapt to the new environment. In other words, things were going well for the most part. One day, my fiancé had gone into the office while I was homesick with the flu. At one point during the day, I remember going into the kitchen to get a snack to just have something in my stomach. Upon entering the kitchen full of unopened boxes, I for some reason get a weird feeling. It wasn't a bad feeling, but rather a feeling that made me alert or something. You know that feeling you get when you feel like someone's watching you? Yeah, I had that in spades. I hesitate before looking out the sliding glass door to see someone walking around my vegetable garden. By the looks of it, they looked like a younger adult in all black wearing a satchel. Now, this house had a gate on the side that only opened if you had the password. However, the password wasn't working, which indicated that he jumped the fence. The thing that really caught my eye was that he appeared to be pouring something around the garden. My initial instinct was to call my fiancée, but realized that he would get worried and try to take this into his own hands. Without any other options, I pick up the phone to call the police. The operator said they'd try to have someone there soon, but to just stay hidden in the meantime. This person continues to look around the garden as I run to my room and lock my door. All the while, I'm on my bed praying to God that he doesn't come inside or break in. Minutes felt like hours before hearing the police sirens from down the road. They got louder as they pulled into my house, where I then heard some sort of commotion going on. Upon going outside, I see 4 police officers restraining this kid who appeared to be an older teen. However, he didn't try to get away. He kinda just stood there, accepting his defeat. As I spoke with the police, I then learned a shocking truth I didn't expect to hear. While they were restraining him, they managed to find several traces of liquid mercury, which is what he was using to put in our garden. It was then where I called my fiancé, where he had to leave work to come home. Turns out, this teenager was actually our next-door neighbor's son. Both his parents were devastated, apologizing to us for his actions. While we understood their pain, we ended up filing charges against the son for attempted murder. How he got a container of mercury, we have no idea. I'm still very thankful I caught him in the act, as I'm not sure if I'd still be writing this had I eaten the vegetables. He was arrested and put in jail for 10 years according to his parents. Later that same day, his parents had told us that their son was innocent and that he was just looking at our garden. Me nor my fiancé wanted to hear it.
This story takes place when I had just recently moved into my new apartment. A really bizarre thing took place. This was almost 2 years ago now, but I will never forget it. My apartment that I was moving into was pretty new. The building was less than 10 years old, and it seemed really well maintained. It also wasn't that big. There were only a few units in each building, and there were 2 buildings total, then an office. There was a parking lot in the middle where basically everybody parked. My apartment had 1 bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room. There were also 2 closets aside from the one in my bedroom. One was a standard coat closet, and the other was more maintenance, like for my water heater and things like that. After I moved all of my stuff in, which took forever, I started putting everything where it belonged. I had a moving company help me get everything transported and up to my unit. I was on the 2nd floor, so it wasn't too bad. So, the very first night, when I was setting everything up and whatnot, I was putting some things in my closet. I was trying to decide where to put everything, and at one point, I went inside the utility closet. When I was in there, I was just looking around, kind of wondering what I would put in it. I happened to notice something strange, though. There was like a panel on the back corner, kind of behind the water heater. I've always had a good attention to detail, and I almost didn't even notice it. This panel was rather large, and it was almost all the way on the floor. I got down on my hands and knees and examined it. The panel almost looked like a door that opened up through the wall. Beyond that wall was the next unit over. I wondered for a moment if that's in fact what it did, but I realized that that didn't make much sense. There was no handle to open it or anything like that, and when I messed around with it a little, it didn't seem that weird. I left it alone and went back to work. I was able to get a few more things organized before I called it for the night. Later on, I went to bed at probably about 10 o'clock. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I remember being wide awake and wondering why I had awoken. Normally, this didn't happen. Everything was pitch black and silent. After a few moments, though, I heard a noise. I just barely did hear it. It sounded like somebody was inside my apartment walking. I laid frozen in bed. I couldn't believe what was going on. I thought to myself, remembering if I had locked my door, and I knew that I did. Then I remembered that thing I thought looked like a door that led to the next unit over. Could that have been real? Who lived over there? Meanwhile, the footsteps got closer. Then my bedroom door started opening. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. There was nothing else I could do. I was just hoping that nothing bad would happen. whoever was in there walked inside and took a couple of steps. Then they stopped. They stood there and didn't seem to move. This went on for a good 2 or 3 minutes. I couldn't take it anymore, and I opened my eyes. I couldn't tell who it was, but it appeared to be a man. He was standing about 10 feet away inside of my bedroom. I couldn't make out any details because of how dark it was. I closed my eyes again and just hoped that whoever this was would leave. I was confident that I hadn't made a sound and that they thought I was sleeping. Finally, whoever was there turned around and left. They walked out of the room and then back towards where they had come from. I did not hear my front door open and shut, but I did hear that closet door open and close. This confirmed it to me. I laid there for the longest time. It took me a while before I could do anything. Finally, I got up and checked all around my apartment. Everything seemed to be in place as it was when I left it. I went back to bed after that. The next day, I got up and went straight for the office. The apartment only had a couple of employees. I spoke with a woman at the front desk and let her know what had happened. She seemed pretty confused. When I confirmed to her my unit number, she told me that nobody lived in the unit next to me. I couldn't believe this. The apartment staff decided to come out and examine it. When I showed it to them, they offered to cover it up, but I made the decision to just move. This was really creepy to me, and I have the suspicion that it was somebody who worked at the apartment complex who was inside my apartment. If the unit to mine really was vacant, the staff would be the only ones with the keys. I'm not sure who exactly it was, but I just wanted to move out of there. Most of my things were still kind of packed up, and that's exactly what I did. To this day, I still wonder about that.
Just a disclaimer, this isn't the type of story to have you on the edge of your seat. It is, however, one of the creepiest occurrences I've ever had, and this just goes to show you how the comfort of your own home can be dangerous. This happened about a year ago, back when I had graduated from college. I had just gotten a paid internship for my field of study as a computer technician. My duties were to basically assist companies with basic computer errors they may face. It was an easy and well-rewarding job for me, as I loved computers ever since I was a kid. At the time, inflation was through the roof, so I was extremely grateful for this job. The only part I didn't like about it were the hours. I had to get up at around 11 p.m. and work well into the night till around 3 a.m., so whenever I got home, I would always be tired. During this internship, I've been renting out this small one-bedroom home as a place to stay. I earned enough to pay for it, but my parents were proud of me for getting this job, which made them pay for half. One night, I had been at work during the middle of my shift when I get a call from my boss. He had told me that he was suspending operations until the next day due to a possible storm emergency. This resulted in me having to clock out and go home for the night. As you could imagine, I was drained from working and instantly fell asleep listening to the falling rain. I'd say I slept for a good 3 hours or so when I awoke to a noise from my room. It sounded similar to a knocking sound, but much more sudden and fast. I glanced over at the clock. It was 4:07 a.m. and was still pouring outside. Figuring it was likely hail hitting the roof, I disregarded it and tried my best to go back to sleep. However, not even a minute later, I hear the same noise again, this time much louder. I felt my blood run cold as I heard this and realized it was coming from my wall. I was almost certain there was an animal living in my walls, as I don't live too far from a wooded area. I slowly get up from my bed and put my sliders on and put my ear up against the wall. It was quiet for a good minute before the unexpected happened. A knock louder than ever hit the wall, where I stumbled back where I just so happened to look up at the air vent. A quick flash of lightning illuminated what appeared to be someone's eyes looking at me through the vent. What disturbed me the most was their face. It was pale, and this person didn't appear to have any eyebrows. That was the best description I could give, as they then ducked back down inside of the wall. I locked eye contact with this person for a good second before running out of the house to call the police. Thankfully, the cops in my city are the type that takes their job seriously, so they were able to get here quickly. One officer stayed with me while the other one inspected the wall and claimed that it was too narrow for anyone to fit through. After hearing this, I checked the wall myself and even went as far as to take it apart to realize that he was right. Needless to say, both officers went out of their way to shine their lights and actually look inside. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary or misplaced, so I thanked them for their time and they left. It was then where I called my parents, wanting to tell them about what I had seen. However, I must have caught them at a bad time, as they didn't want to hear it and claimed it was just night terrors. Now, I did have night terrors from my childhood that made its way into my adult years, but it was rare for me to have one. The next day, I went out to get drywall to replace the piece of wall I had taken out. I have never believed in the paranormal, but I have no other explanation for what I saw. Nothing has happened since, and I intend for it to remain that way.
This is my horror story about when my wife and I moved into our new home a couple of years ago. I remember when we first looked at the house, we both loved it. The neighborhood was great, and the inside of the house was also really good. We knew that we would have to be fast in making an offer, and we did. It was a sort of high price, and we had to make a full price offer, but the house was just too good to pass up. We had already looked at many houses, and this one was by far the best. The sellers ended up accepting our offer, and we were excited to move in. We thought that living there was going to be great, but soon, strange things started happening. I remember within probably a week after moving in, my wife and I were awoken to the sound of a knocking coming from the front door. I got up out of bed and looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. This was very strange. I told my wife I would go down and check it out. The knocking continued. I was hearing it still as I was walking down the stairs. When I got to the bottom of them, though, it stopped. I walked over to the front door and looked out. Nobody was there. I opened the door and looked around, but I couldn't see anybody. Whoever had been there must have left. I looked out into the street, but didn't see or hear any vehicles driving away either. I went back inside and back to bed after that. This was a strange and bizarre thing, but we figured it must be someone at the wrong house or something like that. But later on, maybe a few days later, during broad daylight, there was a knocking on the back door of our house. Both my wife and I were home then as well. We were in the kitchen, which is at the front side of the house, so we couldn't see it. It was strange for somebody to knock on the back door instead of the front. I walked over to see who was there, but by the time I got within sight of it, I couldn't see anyone. Once again, I opened the door and I looked around our backyard, but saw nobody. My wife watched out the front windows, but she didn't see anybody walking over there either. We wondered if the 2 times were the same person. I felt like it probably was. But that wasn't the end of strange things happening. Several days after this, my wife and I returned home one night to find that our mailbox had been run over, it appeared. It had fallen over and was laying on the ground. After this incident, probably a week went by of normalness. Nothing strange happened, at least not that my wife and I were aware of. Then, one night, we were both at home sleeping. I woke up at some point during the night, and I heard the sound of something hit against our bedroom window. Our bedroom was on the 2nd floor, so this was really weird. I sat up and listened. It happened again. It seemed as though something was being thrown at our window, like maybe a rock. I walked over to the window and looked out. I didn't see anybody. By this point, I was really frustrated with all of this going on. I kept watching out the window, waiting for whoever was there to show themselves, but I couldn't see them anywhere. They probably saw me at the window. There was also a good number of places that they could have been hiding, and with it being dark out, I couldn't see very well. I stood there for like 10 minutes, but never saw anybody, and nothing else was thrown towards the window. After that, I went back to bed again. The next and final incident came 2 days later. It was the weekend, and I was up late, much later than usual. My wife had gone to bed, and I was finishing up some work downstairs in the living room. Most of the lights in the house were off. It was after midnight, but I'm not sure exactly what time it was. I just randomly glanced out the window though, and when I did, I saw somebody actually walking up the driveway. They weren't looking at me, and I don't think they could see me. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, but as they got closer, I recognized them. It was our next door neighbor. I couldn't believe it. I ducked down just to be sure that he wouldn't see me. When he got near the front door, he knocked on it. I walked over right away to confront him. When I got to the doorway, I saw him out the window looking at me on the other side. As soon as he saw me, we made eye contact. Then he ran away. Now I knew who had been doing all of this. I was really in shock. I didn't know quite what to do. After that night, I decided to go over and talk to him the next day at his house, but he didn't answer the door. Nothing else that was strange happened after that either. He ended up moving out of the house about a year ago.
We've lived in our neighborhood for nearly 4 years. A few houses down and across the street is a Filipino family. They're pretty nice, and whenever we see each other, we always have small talk, and we know each other by name. We moved in right before I gave birth to my oldest, so they always ask for the baby, and they love seeing them. We have even had meals at each other's homes before. This summer, they had an older family member, maybe 55 to 60 years old, come to visit. We noticed him right away because he would always go for long walks and lingered a lot. One evening, the mother of the family introduced him as her father. He had recently moved and would be staying with them for a while before heading north to her sister's house. He was pretty new to the US and spoke a little English, just enough to get by. He seemed nice enough, but as soon as we walked inside, I told my husband that he gave me a really weird vibe. I had never felt that way of any of the 7 other family members from the home. I've been in their home and shared meals with them. They're very sweet and welcoming. My husband also told me that he did seem a little off, but we just chalked it up to cultural differences. Fast forward about a month. My mother-in-law and my mother came to visit at the very same time. They're in the driveway with our son. I run inside because I'm pregnant and I suffer from severe morning sickness. I come back out 15 minutes later and they're having a frustrating conversation with this man. He was trying to get one of them to drive him to the store, and he would use a food stamp/EBD card to buy their groceries and wanted them to give him cash. They both told him that they weren't interested, but he just kept asking and lingering. When I went outside, I called out to my husband to come out, and when he saw us, he walked away very quickly. Both of our mothers told us what had happened and how forceful that he was being with them. The next few days that I see him walking, we always wave and say simple pleasantries, but every time I would wave, he would take it as a sign to come over and try to have a conversation. I began to let him know that what he did with our mothers is very illegal, and to be so forceful was really unnecessary. He said that he understood, but he would linger. It would always be at a moment where I was trying to strap my toddler to his car seat and I was rushing to get him to school. It would always take me about 10 minutes to get him to get the hint that I couldn't talk, and he would slowly walk away and just linger in our driveway. It eventually got to the point where I would watch to see if he had walked past our house on his morning walk before venturing outside. I really just hated the awkward conversation. He would always seem to round the corner just as I finished strapping my son in the car and I was getting in. I would wave and then jump in quickly and drive off. It just felt really off, like he was waiting for me. One of our neighbors across the street one night told me that she got a weird vibe from him as well. And again, he always lingered. She told me that he did similar things with her when they were outside as well. They were opting to hang in the backyard with the kids just to avoid it altogether. Now, I usually work from home, but one day I went into the office and I was then alerted by the Ring camera. This man was standing and looking in through our kitchen window, just peering, and I could hear our pit bull barking at him. When he saw our dog, he jumped back and I used the microphone to say, "Can I help you? What do you want?" He looked absolutely shocked and then scurried away. I called my husband and I told him to play the video. We both thought it was really creepy. Whenever we saw the family walking that evening, we decided to bring it up to his daughter. She spoke to her father and he claimed that it never happened. We then showed her the video on her phone and he said that he must have gotten lost. The daughter seemed pretty annoyed by him and the entire situation, So him being weird kinda calmed down a bit. After that I could see that his daughter was really annoyed by his behavior, and as they were walking there was a really heated conversation. She later told me that he tends to be overly friendly and he really means no harm, but she talked to him and he would leave us alone. I asked if he had some kind of mental issue or maybe Alzheimer's since he was always getting lost. She told me no, and that he had always acted like that and that she couldn't wait until his sister was ready for him to be sent up north to her. There were a few other neighbors that had also complained to her and the homeowners association as well. Well, about 2 months later, I dropped my son off to preschool. I get home and I have to rush in because I feel really sick. Usually I leave my car door open, but something told me to lock it as soon as I got out. I did so as I was rushing inside. I would also normally leave the door unlocked if I was just going for a quick throw-up session, but again, my instincts told me to lock the bottom and top lock. When I was in the bathroom, right by the front door, throwing up my life, I then hear a rattling at the front door. Someone is turning the lock back and forth. Of course, my ring chimes and I then look at it in between heaves. What do you know? It's the old man and he's trying to get into our home. I go over to the microphone and then say, "You're at the wrong house." To which he responds with,
Let me in, now. I want to tell you something.
Now, I kid you not, it was the best English sentence I had ever heard from someone who wasn't that good with English. I started to feel better pretty quickly and I was now on high alert. I responded with, "What do you want to tell me?" He looked right at the camera.
Let me in your house, now!
This is where I started to panic. He knew he was at the wrong house, but still he was continuing to try and break in. I respond, "Please get off my property. I don't feel comfortable with you here and I'm not letting you in my house." He then starts rattling at the door again really hard and tries to pull it open and then starts knocking on the bathroom window. This is where I get pissed. "Get the hell off my damn property right now. I'm not gonna let you in. If you don't get the hell out of here right now, I'm calling the cops." He then steps back, gives the camera the middle finger, and scurries off. He disappears and I run upstairs and see that he's simply walking back to his house. I let our pit bull out of our bedroom as he had been going crazy during this whole ordeal. I call my husband and he tells me to call the daughter and tell her what happened. I call her and I tell her what happened and she told me not to let him in, ever. She began to warn me that he's been very inappropriate and forceful with all of the women in her family, and she didn't want me to get hurt, especially being pregnant. She eventually comes over about an hour later and I show her the video. She's absolutely fuming over this and very apologetic, and she begs me not to call the cops. She promises me he'll be gone within the next day. The next day, he eventually flies out and his daughter told him that he's no longer welcome in her home. He now lives up north somewhere in Maryland with his other daughter and probably harassing other people as well. I honestly really don't know what would have happened if I didn't follow my instincts that day. I'm just really glad I'm okay.